Welcome to the Forgotten Narrator. Alright, let's be honest. Warhammer 40K is a universe overflowing with war, ancient grudges, and horrifying monstrosities. But if you take a step back from the battlefield, from the bolters and blades, there's a strange and fascinating question lurking in the shadows. How do these alien races even reproduce? I mean, seriously, between galaxy-spanning hive minds, fungus-based warlords, and pain-addicted space elves, the idea of birth and biology becomes less of a natural process and more of a mind-bending glimpse into the bizarre inner workings of an uncaring universe. It's not just weird curiosity either. Reproduction, in any species, is survival. It's about legacy, control, and the ability to keep fighting the endless wars of the 41st millennium. The way a species reproduces isn't just a biological detail. It shapes how it expands, how it wages war, how it builds civilizations, and how it ultimately survives the galaxy's relentless cruelty. Some do it through carefully controlled rituals. Others just sort of erupt from the ground. And some species spread like viruses, weaving their own genetics into the flesh of entire planets. So yeah, this topic is often overlooked, but it's absolutely essential to understanding what makes each Xenos faction tick. If you want to know what drives them, how they grow, and why they're so damn hard to get rid of, then you need to look at how they come into being in the first place. Get ready to dive into some of the strangest, most unsettling, and genuinely fascinating reproductive strategies ever dreamed up in science fiction. Buckle up. It's going to get weird. When you think of the Aeldari, especially the Asuryani of the craft worlds, there's this constant feeling of tragedy wrapped in beauty. These aren't just elves in space, they're survivors of their own apocalypse, and that trauma seeps into everything they do, including, quite heavily, how they approach reproduction. It's strange to even talk about it in the same breath as war and psychic powers, but the truth is, how the Asuryani handle birth and new life says more about their culture than any weapon or ritual ever could. For the Asuryani, reproduction isn't casual. It's not even sacred in the way it might be for other races. It's guarded, feared, even. You have to understand, every Aeldari soul that enters the galaxy is another that could be lost to Slaanesh. That's not a metaphor or a philosophical fear, it's literal. If an Aeldari dies without proper spiritual protection, their soul is devoured by she who thirsts. So imagine the weight of that. Imagine knowing that every child you bring into the world is born into that existential risk. It's no wonder they've built an entire culture around restraint, meditation, and near-obsessive control over emotion and impulse. This is where the path system comes in. It's not just a way to organize their lives, it's a way to protect themselves from themselves. Romantic relationships are often heavily subdued, approached with extreme caution. Most Asuryani live celibate lives for long periods, focusing on their chosen path, whether that's the path of the warrior, the seer, or the artisan. Emotions like desire are seen as dangerous. They're echoes of the decadence that once led to the fall. And sure, love isn't forbidden, but it's something that must be carefully balanced, not indulged. There are even entire paths that focus on emotional discipline to keep these feelings in check. So when children are born among the Asuryani, it's rare. Intentional. You don't get the sense of sprawling families like in humanity. A child isn't just someone to raise, it's a soul to be protected for eternity. There's a theory some fans bring up that craftworld populations are kept relatively stable on purpose, using a mix of biological controls, spiritual practices, and maybe even psychic influence. Some even speculate that advanced reproductive technologies are used to ensure only viable and psychically stable offspring are brought into the world, because a wayward soul or one born unstable could be even more vulnerable to the warp. Another interesting idea that floats around fan discussions is that there's a kind of genetic memory involved in how craftworlders choose to reproduce. Not just biology, but a psychic resonance, seeking a balance in bloodlines and soul patterns, rather than just compatibility. It's speculative, of course, but it fits with the Asuryani way of thinking. Everything must be in harmony, and nothing can be left to chaos or whim. Even love. You also can't ignore the role of the Infinity Circuit in all of this. It acts as a kind of collective soul vault, a spiritual shelter for the dead, but also a subtle reminder for the living. Their ancestors aren't gone, they're still there, watching, guiding. Some fans suggest that this eternal presence acts as both a comfort and a pressure. Bringing a new life into a craft world means introducing another voice into that chorus, another thread into the great psychic web. It's not done lightly. It can't be. And honestly, I kind of love that about them. There's a poetic tragedy in it. While other races multiply in the millions and spread like wildfire, the Asuryani walk the edge of extinction with grace and intention. Every child is a decision made by a people who already lost everything once and who refuse to let history repeat itself. Their reproductive restraint isn't just about survival, it's a form of defiance. A statement that they've learned, that they've evolved, and that they won't give the galaxy or the gods the satisfaction of watching them fall again. So no, they don't reproduce often. And when they do, it's not with joy or celebration in the way we might imagine. It's with a quiet kind of hope, wrapped in fear and protected by centuries of wisdom. And that makes every Asuryani child not just a person, but a legacy. An echo of a civilization still struggling to hold on to meaning in a universe that wants nothing more than to snuff it out. When you start diving into how the Aeldari reproduce, one thing becomes immediately clear. It's not just a biological process for them. It's a sacred, almost mournful act, tied up with the tragedy of their near extinction. Unlike many of the galaxy's races, the Aeldari don't reproduce frequently or easily. In fact, their ability to create new life has become something incredibly rare, fragile, and precious. And while some of that is tied to the natural complexities of their physiology, a lot of it comes from the aftermath of the fall, the great cataclysm that reshaped their species forever. Biologically, Aeldari reproduction isn't too dissimilar from humans on the surface. They're humanoid with compatible internal systems, but that's just scratching the surface. Their psychic sensitivity, refined genetics, and deep connection to the immaterium have made every part of their being more complex and volatile. Aeldari children, for example, are born with some level of psychic awareness from the start. That's both a gift and a burden. It means their biology has to carry and balance far more than just flesh and blood. It has to hold and protect a soul that shines brighter in the warp than most others. Because of that, Aeldari pregnancies are rare and incredibly delicate. There are hints, both from lore and fan interpretations, that even among bonded couples, conception requires a harmony of body, mind, and soul that's difficult to achieve. And it's not helped by the fact that so many Aeldari live rigid, ascetic lives, dedicated to avoiding temptation and emotional chaos. Even the idea of forming a pair bond or having children can seem like a dangerous path, potentially leading to emotional excess that might attract the gaze of darker powers. It's also believed that Aeldari genetics, once engineered or naturally evolved to near perfection, are now facing degradation. Not in the way humans experience genetic drift or mutation, but in the sense that their population is too small and too psychically active to maintain long-term stability without external help. This fragility makes every birth something akin to a miracle. And the craft worlds know it. Children are few and far between, but when they are born, they are celebrated, protected, and fiercely treasured, not just by their families, but by entire communities. There's this recurring idea in fan circles that Aeldari's souls, because of how bright they burn in the warp, require more than just two bodies to generate new life. Some theorize there are rituals, meditations, or even specific alignments of warp energy that must be in place for conception to be successful. It's not canon, of course, but it fits the vibe of a race that treats every child as a blessing, and every parent as someone who's taken on a nearly divine responsibility. Some have even speculated that certain farseers or spirit seers are involved in guiding the process, not in a clinical way, but as spiritual protectors, ensuring the soul of the unborn child isn't touched by chaos during gestation. And then there's the cultural pressure. Think about it. From the Aeldari perspective, every new child isn't just a person. They're a potential future, a sliver of hope that their race might one day recover from the brink of annihilation. They know extinction is a real threat, not an abstract one. It happened once, it could happen again. That burden falls heavily on the few who are willing and able to bear children. It's not something done casually. It's a decision weighed with the full gravity of their people's history on their shoulders. That's why the protection of the young is one of the few things that unites all Aeldari, regardless of craftworld, path, or belief. Even in times of war or dire need, children are shielded at all costs. It's almost instinctive. Some craftworlds even have dedicated guardians and seers whose sole purpose is the spiritual and physical safety of their youth. And honestly, that makes a lot of sense. When you've lost so much, when your gods are dead, your empire shattered, and your souls are hunted, you guard what remains with a kind of sacred fury. For the Aeldari, every child is not just a person. They're a promise, a prayer, a fragile thread connecting them to a future that's still uncertain but desperately worth fighting for. One of the most haunting things about the Aeldari is how their society has had to reshape itself around the sheer rarity of birth. On craftworlds, the arrival of a newborn is not just a family event, it's a moment that echoes through the entire ship. It's hard to even call it a birth in the way we humans understand it. There's no hospital waiting room filled with nervous family, no big extended gatherings. Instead, the birth of an Aeldari child is more like the emergence of something sacred. It's quiet, deliberate, almost ritualistic. And above all, it's enveloped in layers of spiritual and psychic protection that we as humans can barely wrap our heads around. The absence of traditional family structures might be one of the more surprising things to outsiders. You'd think a species on the brink of extinction would double down on bonds of blood, but Aeldari culture doesn't really work that way. Their society is built around paths, disciplines of thought and purpose that shape every part of their lives. Because of that, child-rearing isn't just a parent's responsibility, it's a communal effort. Specialized caregivers, spirit seers, and mentors raise and guide the young along carefully chosen paths. These aren't cold, distant institutions either. There's genuine emotional depth there, but it's channeled through structure and mindfulness, rather than impulsive affection. It's not that Aeldari parents don't love their children, they just don't believe love alone is enough to protect them from the galaxy. And they're right, honestly, because psychic threats to Aeldari infants are very, very real. These kids aren't just biologically sensitive, they're wide open to the warp in a way that's dangerous if left unchecked. That's why even from birth, Aeldari children are closely monitored and shielded by wraithbone structures woven with psychic wards. It's not uncommon for spirit seers to visit newborns regularly, checking their psychic resonance and helping to anchor them safely to the material realm. And again, this isn't some grim, sterile procedure. It's part of their worldview, one that sees the soul as the true self, and the body as something that must be safeguarded to protect it. Fans have talked for years about how this system probably prevents all sorts of disasters. Imagine a newborn Aeldari having a psychic tantrum. Without those safeguards, the warp could take notice, or worse, something inside the warp might reach back. So the craft worlds invest a massive amount of their resources into ensuring these children grow up with discipline, balance, and above all, control. It's not a luxury, it's survival. The social structure built around children is like a finely tuned ecosystem. Everyone has a role to play. Guardians protect, bone singers craft their environments, and even warlocks and farseers help guide their early spiritual growth. Kids are introduced to the paths early on, not to restrict them, but to help them find their identity in a universe that wants nothing more than to strip it away. There's an elegance to it, a sense of long-term vision that humanity often lacks. And honestly, it kind of makes you wonder how different things would be for us if we treated each child as a potential soul to be protected from damnation instead of just another addition to the population. Technologically, they're light years ahead, and they use that tech to support life in ways that are subtle and deeply integrated. The birthing chambers of a craft world are said to be cradles of psycho-reactive wraithbone, adapting to the energy signatures of mother and child. Some believe that these chambers even hum with ancient songs, echoes of the old Aeldari Empire, meant to soothe and strengthen the developing soul. Artificial wombs haven't been confirmed, but fan theories often explore the idea. If any species could manage safe external gestation without stripping away emotional depth, it's the Aeldari. They wouldn't use such tech out of convenience, but out of necessity, and only if it meant safeguarding the psychic purity of the unborn. Compared to humans, who often take birth for granted, the Aeldari approach it with a solemnity that's both beautiful and heartbreaking. For us, children are the norm. For them, they're the exception. Rare flickers of light in a race overshadowed by the looming threat of extinction. And maybe that's why they're willing to do so much, sacrifice so much, to ensure that each one makes it. Not just into the world, but into adulthood, intact and whole, body and soul alike. In a galaxy where death is everywhere, the Aeldari cling to life like it's a secret they're afraid to speak aloud. And maybe, just maybe, that's what keeps them going. If the Aeldari treat reproduction as a sacred, delicate miracle, the Drukhari treat it as, well, something that just sort of happens. Not because they value life or the continuation of their kind, or even because they care about legacy. No, reproduction in Kamara is a byproduct of indulgence, of domination, of lust, completely unrestrained by empathy or morality. And yeah, technically, Drukhari are biologically Aeldari. They share the same basic anatomy, the same psychic potential, the same origin. But the way they use their bodies, that's where the similarities end. In Kamara, sex isn't about love or connection. It's not even always about pleasure. It's about control. It's about power. And because of that, reproduction becomes incidental, something that can occur during acts of cruelty, ritual, or sheer indulgence. It's not a goal, it's a side effect. And that's part of what makes Drukhari culture so terrifying. They can reproduce just fine, probably even more easily than their Craftworld cousins, but they do so without intention, without care, and often without even realizing or acknowledging it's happening. Some fan theories suggest that Drukhari birth rates are actually quite high, especially compared to Craftworld Aeldari, precisely because of this unchecked environment. But that doesn't mean the population of Kamara is stable or safe. Far from it. Life is cheap in the Dark City. Children born there are more likely to die in a gladiatorial pit than live past their first century. There's no reverence for new life, no support structure. Birth is biological noise in a society built on suffering. If a child survives, it's because they were brutal enough to avoid becoming someone else's entertainment. And then there's the question of consent, because let's not sugarcoat it. A lot of what passes for reproduction in Drukhari society is rooted in coercion, violence, or outright horror. Kamara isn't a place of mutual affection. It's a place where bodies are tools, weapons, and sometimes trophies. That's not to say every act of reproduction is monstrous, but it's safe to assume that many are. The Dark Eldar don't see this as wrong. They don't think in terms of right or wrong at all. Their entire worldview is built around feeding on pain and sensation to stave off the hunger of she who thirsts. If reproduction happens along the way, so be it. Some of the creepiest theories floating around fan circles deal with how Drukhari might intentionally manipulate genetics through breeding, like breeding gladiators or perfecting lineages for specific arenas or roles within their twisted hierarchy. Not just because it's practical, but because it adds another layer of control. Imagine breeding someone to feel more pain or to survive longer under torture, just for the thrill of watching them break. It's not confirmed in lore, but honestly, it wouldn't be surprising. In Kamara, pain isn't just a currency, it's a form of art. And what better canvas than living flesh? And that brings us to mutation. Kamara is a place of intense warp pressure, arcane technologies, and radical experimentation. While the Drukhari are no fans of chaos, that doesn't mean their environment is stable. Mutations happen, and instead of purging them, the Drukhari often see them as interesting, useful, maybe even beautiful in a grotesque sort of way. Some Cabal leaders are said to cultivate mutations or altered bloodlines to create more interesting subjects. Others use surgical or alchemical enhancement to push the limits of their offspring or their victims. The line between natural reproduction and bioengineering gets blurred fast in the Dark City. That's part of the horror and the allure. The Drukhari have no moral compass when it comes to life. They don't care how it's made, only what can be done with it. Children, clones, vat-spawned hybrids, it's all the same to them. Each body is a vessel for pleasure, torment, dominance, or utility, and reproduction? It's just another tool. Another opportunity to play God in the most disturbing sandbox imaginable. They don't value continuity, they value the moment. And in that moment, whatever is born might be raised, discarded, broken, or twisted, depending entirely on who notices it first. And yet, ironically, this chaotic approach means the Drukhari might be among the most biologically resilient of all the Aeldari. They don't need love, ritual, or stability to multiply. They thrive in rot, in violence, in ruin. It's messed up, but it's effective. You look at the Craftworlders and see a people clinging desperately to the threads of life. You look at the Drukhari and see a people who turned reproduction into another weapon, ugly, efficient, and terrifyingly abundant. One of the most disturbing aspects of Drukhari society isn't just how they reproduce in the traditional sense, it's how little they need to. In Kamara, the dark heart of their civilization, birth isn't sacred, and biology isn't destiny. If a Drukhari wants more bodies, more soldiers, more slaves, or even more versions of themselves, they don't need a partner. They don't even need a womb. They just need a vat, a few samples of genetic material, and someone skilled enough in the dark arts of bioarcana. And believe me, Kamara is filled with people like that. Homunculi covens are at the center of this grotesque miracle factory. These twisted flesh sculptors aren't just surgeons or necromancers, they're artisans of pain, obsessed with immortality, genetic manipulation, and the perfect fusion of function and aesthetic horror. They don't create life because they value it. They do it because they can. To a homunculus, making a new Drukhari from scratch isn't a miracle. It's Tuesday. These beings have transcended any moral understanding of life, birth, or identity, and the results are terrifying. Cloning is probably the most innocent thing they do, and even that's a stretch. The process is rarely used for continuity or lineage. It's used to generate bodies for experimentation, disposable shock troops, or twisted copies of once powerful figures. It's not uncommon for Cabal leaders to have backup clones made in case they die, which in Kamara is more of a question of when than if. And these clones aren't always identical. Some are altered to enhance reflexes, pain resistance, or sheer brutality. Others are deliberately made unstable, just to see what happens. There's no standard, just curiosity. Mass vat-grown creations are even more horrifying. In the dark labs of the homunculi, bodies can be grown in clusters, unfinished, twitching, malformed things suspended in glowing fluid. These creatures might never be given minds of their own. They might just be empty shells waiting for a soul. Or worse, they might have partial minds, enough to feel, to suffer, but never enough to resist. It's this blending of living flesh with pure functionality that really sets the Drukhari apart from other races. The body becomes a tool, a resource, something to be stored, reshaped, used, and discarded. This leads to a strange philosophical question that fans have debated endlessly. Do the Drukhari even care about natural reproduction anymore? Have they completely abandoned it in favor of artificial methods? Some believe the instinct is still there, buried deep beneath layers of sadism and synthetic biology. Others argue that the homunculi have effectively replaced the need for it. Why go through the risk and mess of pregnancy when you can commission a homunculus to grow a perfect servant, warrior, or heir? And that's the thing. What's perfect in Kamara is rarely about love or family. It's about strength, obedience, and entertainment value. A perfect child isn't one you raise and nurture. It's one you grow in a tube, mold with pain, and unleash in the arenas or the battlefield. There's no lullabies in the nurseries of Kamara, because there are no nurseries. Just labs. Just flesh. Just horror. The moral decay this represents is massive. Even for a grimdark setting like Warhammer 40K, the Drukhari stand out because they've inverted every value we associate with life and birth. There's no dignity in their creations, no compassion, no purpose beyond the next kill, the next show, the next power move. Life for them is a material to be harvested, and once you cross that line, there's really no going back. I've seen fan takes that suggest some of the older Drukhari, the ancient ones who remember life before the fall, might still cling to old instincts. That deep down, some part of them remembers what it meant to create out of care, not cruelty. Maybe. But if that memory exists, it's drowned beneath oceans of blood and centuries of horror. Komarov doesn't reward sentiment, it rewards spectacle. And maybe that's the scariest part. The Drukhari don't need nature anymore. They've mastered the art of synthetic existence, and they've used it to strip reproduction of anything resembling beauty, love, or meaning. It's a tool now, a horror show, a production line of nightmares, and they wouldn't have it any other way. There's something profoundly chilling about imagining a child born in Kamara. Not just because it's rare, or because it happens in the middle of a city built on pain, but because the concept of childhood simply doesn't exist there the way it does for other species. In most cultures, even the more brutal ones, children are given some level of protection, a grace period to grow, to learn, to be nurtured. But in Kamara, that idea is completely alien. There is no innocence, no safety net, no one coming to tuck you in at night. If you're born in the Dark City, you're already prey, or at best, a contestant. What happens to a Drukhari child depends entirely on whose hands they fall into. Some are the unwanted result of casual violence or pleasure, abandoned to the lower districts to be scooped up by slavers, gangs, or worse. Others are deliberately bred, though raised would be a generous term. They might be trained like animals, taught to fight, torture, and dominate before they can even speak fluently. In a place like Kamara, education isn't about knowledge or wisdom, it's about sharpening teeth, both literal and metaphorical. A child is not a future citizen, they're a potential weapon. And like all weapons, they're tested, broken, and reforged until they're useful or discarded. One of the darkest truths of Drukhari society is that there's no such thing as parental love. Power structures in Kamara are defined by strength, cunning, and the ability to inspire fear. That applies to everyone, from archons down to the lowest wretches in the pleasure pits. A mother or father might produce offspring, but they don't see them as sons or daughters. They see them as investments, extensions of their will, or liabilities to be eliminated if they show weakness. There's no bedtime stories, no protection from the horrors outside. If anything, those horrors are deliberately turned inward. The sooner the child learns to survive pain, the less likely they are to die screaming in the arenas. Some cabals and cults have their own twisted approaches to raising young. There are whispers of breeding pits where children are pitted against each other, and only those who emerge victorious are allowed to grow older. Others might be raised as living art, sculpted, sometimes literally, by homunculi, into grotesque masterpieces, praised for their symmetry or savaged for a flaw. And this isn't hyperbole. There are documented instances in the lore where the Drukhari treat people, even their own kin, as sculptures or canvases for torture and display. So it's not a stretch to imagine a child raised not for who they are, but for how well they bleed. Fan theories have always danced around the idea of whether any Drukhari can feel genuine affection. Some think maybe, just maybe, there are a few who form something like bonds with their offspring, especially among the more ancient cabals, where lineage might still hold ceremonial weight. But even then, affection would likely manifest as pride in how ruthless the child becomes, not in who they are as a person. To care too deeply would be seen as weakness. And in Kamara, weakness is an open invitation to be destroyed. Status plays a huge role too. A child born to a powerful archon might have advantages, sure, but they'll also be targeted more viciously. Others will want to break them just to shame the parent, so they grow up with knives pointed in every direction, constantly tested, challenged, and manipulated. If they survive long enough, they might rise in the hierarchy. If not, no one remembers their name. There's no safety in legacy. In fact, legacy can be a curse. Better to be underestimated and cruel than noble and dead. And here's the thing that always gets to me: there's no future in this system. The Drukhari are breeding not for tomorrow, not to build, but to entertain themselves in the now. A child isn't a hope or a dream, it's a potential new instrument of suffering, or a victim in waiting. You either learn to torture better than anyone else, or you end up flayed and laughing in the arena, pumped full of combat drugs and pain enhancers. Those are your options. There's no middle class, no peaceful life waiting on the horizon. Just an endless spiral of cruelty wrapped in decadence. Some fans have suggested that this is why true births are so rare in Kamara, because even the Drukhari, deep down, know how cursed their society is. That on some subconscious level, they understand that bringing life into that world is an act of pure selfishness, maybe even madness. But the city never stops. The hunger never fades. So children keep appearing, shaped by shadow, molded in agony, and unleashed upon the galaxy as perfect reflections of the place that spawned them. And maybe that's what makes them so horrifying. Not that they're evil for the sake of it, but that they were never given a chance to be anything else. There's something uniquely tragic about the Necrons. Something that goes beyond their cold, metallic husks and deathless silence. They weren't always this way. Once, long before the galaxy knew them as soulless machine legions, they were a fully organic race, known as the Necron. And though their civilization was brilliant in many ways, it was also cursed, ravaged by disease, plagued by short lifespans, and driven by a deep-seatedness toward the universe itself. Back then, they reproduced like any other organic species. They had families, dynasties, and bloodlines, however joyless they may have been. But all of that is gone now. Completely and irrevocably erased the moment they stepped into those cold metal shells. The transformation from Necron to Necrons was not just a change in form, it was the death of their biology. When the Tan offered them the promise of immortality through biotransference, they took it. They let their flesh be stripped away, their minds uploaded into undying machines, and in doing so, they severed themselves from everything that made reproduction possible. No more DNA. No more pregnancy. No more birth. Their race became a static archive of consciousness and machinery, locked in eternal stasis or marching endlessly across the stars, incapable of creating life in any traditional sense. So the question becomes, can a species truly survive if it can no longer reproduce? The answer, at least for the Necrons, depends on how you define survival. They don't create new individuals, not in the way we understand. They don't grow new minds. There are no Necron children, no generations, no youthful heirs waiting to take up the mantle. What they do have is memory, long, bitter, and unbroken. They carry their legacy forward, not through blood, but through eternal recurrence. Through the reactivation of ancient tomb worlds, the repair of damaged units, and the endless recycling of what already exists. Still, there are fan theories, of course there are, that suggest a few Necron overlords have considered reversing the biotransference process. Maybe they miss something of their old selves. Maybe they want to feel again. To taste, to touch, to procreate. Not for pleasure, but for meaning. There are whispers of experiments in regrowing organic tissue, of hybridization with cloned remnants of Necron DNA. Nothing confirmed, of course. But it's one of those ideas that refuses to die in fan circles. That somewhere, in a forgotten crypt deep beneath a dead moon, a Necron noble is trying to bring back what was lost. Not just immortality, but life. Realistically, though, the Necrons have moved past biology. Their entire society is built on a different foundation now. What once was reproduction has become preservation. Where once they might have raised sons, now they awaken legions. The tomb complexes that house their endless warriors don't build new Necrons. They simply store the old ones waiting for the call to war. In that sense, reproduction for them is more like reanimation. Their numbers don't grow. They reappear, emerge, return. And yet, it's worth considering how that shift changes the very concept of lineage. Among the Necrons, inheritance is purely intellectual, strategic, and political. Dynasties are maintained not by bloodlines but by continuity of will and memory. An overlord rules until destroyed, and even then they might return, rebuilt, restored, or copied into another form. There's no aging, no decline, no handing down of power unless someone takes it by force. And that creates a society frozen in time, unchanging, unyielding, and strangely hollow. There's a certain loneliness to it, too. Even the most powerful Necron lords walk through eternity without offspring, without legacy in the traditional sense. They command millions, but they leave behind nothing new. Their dynasties stretch across the stars, but they are echoes, reverberations of a race that gave up its future in exchange for permanence. It's efficient, it's terrifying, and it's deeply, deeply sad. So no, the Necrons don't reproduce, not biologically, not anymore. They don't need to. But in doing away with that need, they also severed their connection to growth, to change, and to what it means to be alive. They became eternal, but at the cost of becoming truly alone. When it comes to the Necrons, thinking about reproduction in the traditional sense just doesn't apply. Their numbers don't grow through birth or biology, but through something far colder, more calculated, and honestly, way more chilling. The Necrons replenish their forces not by creating new life, but by waking up what was never truly dead to begin with. Across the galaxy, thousands of tomb worlds still lie dormant, sealed beneath layers of rock, wraithbone, or even forgotten cities. And when the time is right, or when some foolish archaeotech explorer presses the wrong rune, those worlds stir. The awakening of Necron legions is a kind of rebirth, but it's mechanical, not organic. There's no joy in it, no moment of creation, just machinery kicking into gear after millions of years, sarcophagi sliding open with a hiss, and skeletal warriors shuddering back to life, their memories fragmented, their orders etched into ancient code. Some rise in perfect form. Others glitch, stumble, or spark, victims of decayed systems or corrupted protocols. But the point is, they don't need to build new bodies from scratch when they've already got an entire civilization sleeping under the stars. This is where the role of repair and maintenance becomes essential. Necrons don't truly die unless their bodies are utterly destroyed, and even then, if the control node or the resurrection protocols survive, they can often be rebuilt. That's where Canoptech constructs come in. These spider-like drones, scarabs, and towering repair machines are the caretakers of Necron infrastructure. They scuttle through the dark tombs like ants in a hive, repairing limbs, replacing components, and reactivating units as needed. If a Necron warrior is damaged in battle, it's not taken to a medbay. It's retrieved, patched, and returned to the fight. Sometimes this happens in the middle of battle. Sometimes it takes centuries. But as long as the protocols hold, a Necron can come back. That said, it raises a strange question. Does the creation of Canoptech units count as reproduction? These constructs weren't once Necrontire. They never had souls or minds in the organic sense. They're built, programmed, and deployed as tools of maintenance and war. But someone or something has to build them. And while most of these processes are automated, run by ancient forges buried in tomb complexes, there's still an origin point. Somewhere in the cold logic of Necron design, new things are being created, even if they lack sentience. So maybe that's their new version of offspring, a species that no longer reproduces, but replicates function through its tools. And here's where it gets weirder. Not all Necron constructs are mindless. Some, like the Canoptech spiders or toonblades, operate with a kind of semi-autonomy, following ancient directives, but capable of adapting in combat. They're not fully sentient, but they're not just drones either. So are they children? No, probably not. But it's hard to shake the idea that the Necron race has shifted from reproduction of individuals to replication of systems. It's not about continuing bloodlines, it's about perpetuating function. Fans have long speculated about the existence of central production centers deep within the most ancient tomb worlds, fully automated foundries still churning out replacements and constructs long after their original masters have gone silent. Some believe these forges are powered by enslaved stars or hidden black hole reactors, endlessly converting raw matter into new Necron forms. And if that's true, then the Necrons haven't just transcended biology, they've industrialized their own existence. No evolution, no growth, just repetition, precision, perfection. Even the higher echelons of Necron society, like the cryptechs and overlords, rely on these systems to maintain their legions. They don't create new leaders by grooming successors. They preserve themselves or transfer their minds into newer, more advanced bodies. There's no need for a new generation when you can just remake the old one better. In this way, the Necron race has achieved a kind of immortality, but one that comes at the cost of change, diversity, and organic innovation. So instead of generations, the Necrons cycle. Instead of birth, they reboot. And instead of death, they disassemble and reconstruct. Their family tree isn't a tree at all. It's a circuit, an eternal loop of activation, battle, dormancy, and repair. It's brilliant, efficient, and completely alien. The idea of legacy is replaced with continuity of code. They're not worried about who comes next. They just make sure what already exists can rise again and again and again. The thing that keeps me up at night about the Necrons isn't their immortality, or their undying legions, or even their terrifying weapons. It's the question of whether they can still evolve. Or, more precisely, whether they can still multiply in any meaningful sense. Because once you remove biology from the equation, once you strip a species down to circuitry and protocols, what's left? Can a being that doesn't reproduce still grow? Can it still create? That's where the weird mystery of Necron identity comes in. See, most of what we know about Necrons comes from the outside looking in. They don't exactly hand out pamphlets on how their society functions, and their culture is insanely old and secretive. But we do know that every Necron was once a Necron Tyre, once a living being. Their minds, their souls, if you want to call them that, were transferred into living metal. But what happens when one of those original minds is destroyed? Can they be replaced? Or is every Necron just a slowly degrading echo of a long-dead past? Some fans believe that cryptechs, their technomancers, may have figured out ways to copy or even generate entirely new personalities. The idea is that if you can store a mind, you can probably duplicate it, or at least create a synthetic variation. Maybe that's how they produce new commanders, or fill gaps in the chain of command when high-ranking units are destroyed. But here's the catch. We've never actually seen a new Necron, someone who didn't exist before the biotransference. No one born after the Great Transformation. No one truly new. That absence feels loud. And yet, there's something deeply compelling about the idea of synthetic evolution. Imagine a cryptech laboratory deep beneath a tomb world, its databanks running complex simulations, its fabrication arrays churning out prototype minds. Not clones, not backups, but entirely original constructs, built from fragments of old personalities, ancient combat data, and refined logic matrices. Would these be children? Not in any biological sense, but maybe in a way that matters to the Necrons, continuations of thought, of purpose, of legacy. The concept of soul factories pops up in fan discussions a lot, places where fragments of the Necron Tyre essence could be extracted, filtered, and recombined into new sentience. Is it possible? Lore doesn't say, but it wouldn't be totally out of character. The Necrons are masters of soul science. They broke reality to escape death, after all. If any species could create consciousness artificially, it would be them. The real question is, would they want to? From what we know, the Necrons aren't big fans of unpredictability. Their entire system thrives on order, hierarchy, and control. Creating a brand new individual, a mind that wasn't forged in the fires of Necron Tyre society, might be seen as a risk. A rogue variable in an otherwise tightly regulated machine. But maybe that's the exact kind of risk some cryptechs or overlords are willing to take. Maybe there's a dynasty out there quietly experimenting, trying to replicate not just bodies but will. That would explain some of the stranger anomalies reported in fringe tomb worlds. Units acting outside of expected protocols, strange new command hierarchies emerging, even shifts in personality from ancient figures long thought static. There's also speculation that certain dynasties, like the Sarachan, who hold ancient secrets even other Necrons fear, may have unlocked forbidden knowledge on how to replicate leadership. Not clone, not imitate, but truly forge new overlords. Not resurrecting the past, but shaping something for the future. And if that's true, then we're talking about the birth of new dynasties. Not just replication, but true expansion. A terrifying thought, because it means the Necrons haven't just returned, they're evolving again, just in ways we can't detect. But again, all of this is speculation. The Necrons are a wall of silence when it comes to their internal processes. We only see the armies, the battles, the towering monoliths in the sky. What we don't see is what happens in the quiet tombs, in the databanks of the cryptechs, in the flicker of artificial consciousness behind dead eyes. Maybe they're just repairing, recycling, preserving. But maybe, just maybe, they're creating something new. Something we're not ready for. That's what's so haunting about the Necrons. Not just what they are, but what they could become. Because if they ever figure out how to replicate themselves not just as machines, but as minds, then they're not just a remnant of the past anymore. They're a future no one else in the galaxy is prepared for. Orks are without a doubt one of the strangest and most chaotic forces in the galaxy. But when you really stop and think about how they reproduce, that strangeness turns into something utterly fascinating. They don't mate, they don't love, they don't even have genders. And yet, they multiply faster and more effectively than most species in the galaxy. Why? Because they're not mammals. They're not even really animals. Orks are fungus-based life forms. Yeah, giant, green, war-hungry mushrooms with fists the size of cinder blocks. And what's really wild is how natural it feels to them. Orks don't question their biology. They don't sit around wondering where they came from. They just are. They fight, they die, and their spores take root. That's it. That's the whole reproductive cycle. Every ork, every grot, even snotlings and squigs, constantly shed spores into the environment around them. When those spores hit the right conditions, moisture, heat, maybe a splash of blood for flavor, they start to grow. Not just into orks, but into a whole supporting ecosystem. From bitey little squigs to tinkering mech boys and muscle-bound knobs, an entire army baked right into the dirt. This isn't just efficient, it's genius. Because it means that wherever orks go, they stay. Even if a wah gets wiped out, even if the Imperium glass the planet and declare it clean, those spores can lie dormant for years, decades, maybe centuries. And then, one day, a few spores pop and suddenly there's another infestation. First some squigs, then a few grots. Then, bam, boys, knobs, and a full-blown ork settlement, complete with shootas, teeth economy, and that unstoppable drive to fight. And it's not even parasitic in the traditional sense. The orks don't need a host to gestate inside. The planet itself becomes the host. The soil becomes orky. It's terrifying when you think about it. Any planet that's ever had a significant ork presence is essentially cursed. You can't really get rid of them. Not unless you completely burn the biosphere down to nothing. And even then, people in the fandom joke that ork spores could probably survive exterminatus if a few rocks made it off-world. It's not even that far-fetched. One of the things I've always loved is how this biology reflects their culture. Orks don't plan invasions in a traditional sense. They just arrive, and the environment does the rest. They don't need supply lines or breeding programs or logistics. They just fight, die, and spread. Every battlefield is also a seeding ground. Every corpse is future reinforcements. You kill one ork and you're actually planting the next dozen. That's some real grimdark poetry right there. The role of environment is key too. Spores don't just pop up overnight. They need the right conditions. Heat, humidity, maybe even the psychic presence of violence to really get going. Some fans think it's more than just biology, that there's a kind of psychic field, an echo of the orkish wag energy that jumpstarts the spores into developing. Like the spores want to grow where the fighting is best. It's not canon, but it fits too well. Orks don't just grow, they converge, drawn by the potential of more war. It's like the universe itself conspires to keep them going. And what makes them biologically immortal in a sense is that there's no fixed lifespan for orks. They don't age in the usual way. They just get bigger, meaner, and more dangerous the longer they survive. Some of the biggest war bosses in the lore, like Rak'Gol, have been around for ages, evolving through sheer conflict. And even if they die, they leave behind a legacy in the dirt. Their spores are already there, baking under the sun, waiting to explode into another green tide. There's no love in any of this. No parenting, no nurturing, no family ties. And yet it works flawlessly. The galaxy is littered with ork infestations, some so deeply rooted that entire sectors just try to quarantine them instead of rooting them out. You can't reason with it. You can't kill it permanently. You can't negotiate with it. Ork reproduction isn't just a biological process. It's a planetary infection. Honestly, it's kind of beautiful in the most horrifying way. The orks are the ultimate expression of the might makes right philosophy, and their biology reflects that. No waiting, no downtime, no logistics, just endless, recursive violence. And it never, ever stops. The weirdest thing about orks, and trust me, that's saying a lot, is how little we actually understand their life cycle. I mean, we know they come from spores. That part's pretty solid, confirmed in the lore and all. But what happens after the spore lands and starts to grow? That's where things get murky, and where some of the most interesting fan theories start to come in. Because if orks are essentially fungus and they grow rather than being born, then the whole idea of an ork childhood becomes a mystery. You don't see baby orks running around. You don't see schools or nurseries. You just see grots, snotlings, and full-sized boys. And we've all wondered more than once if that's actually a developmental progression. There's a theory I really like, one that pops up in forums all the time, that Gretchens are essentially the juvenile stage of an ork. Not just smaller orcs in a different social class, but literally what an orc starts as. They pop out of the ground as little sneaky, squirmy grots, and then over time, maybe months, maybe years, they bulk up into boys. And it kind of makes sense, right? They're smarter than snotlings, but way weaker than knobs. They're cowardly, but they still have that orky tendency to lie, steal, and follow the strongest. They operate in the shadows of bigger orcs, serving, learning, surviving. What really sells this theory is that orc society doesn't care about origin stories. Grots aren't adopted, taught, or even named in any consistent way. They just show up, do their thing, and maybe, eventually, become something more. There's no rite of passage, no big transformation moment. They just fight, grow, and change. Some fans believe that the psychic field orcs generate, what powers their collective Wa energy, actually triggers this development. That a grot who spends enough time among boys will, without realizing it, start to morph into one. Bones get denser, muscles expand, the brain simplifies but becomes more aggressive. It's like evolution, but personalized and fast-tracked by violence. And yet, we never really see this happen in the lore. Maybe that's intentional. Orcs aren't introspective. They don't keep records or write memoirs. No orc has ever sat down and wondered, "Oi, where'd I come from?" That kind of thinking is dangerously close to heresy in orky society. Too many questions and you might get a choppa to the face. But that doesn't stop us from asking. And honestly, the fact that orcs have no memory of their own beginnings might be one of the more unsettling parts of their existence. Think about it. An orc might just wake up one day, fully formed, with no memory, no name, just a vague idea that he wants to smash something. That's horrifying. No sense of time, no sense of self, just instinct and aggression, shaped by proximity to other orcs and the psychic pressure of the Wah. Maybe that's why their society is so blunt. There's no room for self-discovery when your entire culture is a pressure cooker of war and dominance. It also raises questions about self-awareness. Do grots know they could become orcs? Do they even want to? Or are they doomed to scurry and serve forever unless something clicks? Some fans argue that only a select few grots ascend in this way, that you have to be unusually bold, cunning, or violent to trigger the transformation. Others think it's more about proximity and survival. Stick around long enough without getting stomped, and eventually, you get big. Like moss that grows thicker in the shade of a tree, only the tree is a knob with a power claw. And yeah, there's always been the lingering question, where are the baby orcs? If they don't start as grots, then what's the in-between phase? Are there mini orcs we just never see because they're too fragile or too fast to hide? Or maybe the fungal process skips that entirely. Maybe an orc just bursts from the ground already angry, armed, and arguing about who's the boss. It would be hilariously fitting. They don't need childhoods. They don't need innocence. They just need a big enough spore bed and a reason to hit something. The whole life cycle is shrouded in mystery, not because it's hidden, but because orcs themselves don't care enough to notice. It's not like they're lying to us. They just literally don't think about it. They wake up, fight, die, and the cycle starts again. No one writes it down. No one studies it. The Imperium's xenobiologists probably go mad trying to piece it together from battlefield observations and half-digested spore clusters. And maybe that's the beauty of it. Orcs don't need to understand themselves to thrive. Their biology just works. Their life cycle fits perfectly into their purpose. From spore to squig to screaming warboss, it's all one big fungal miracle powered by violence and momentum. And whether grots are just mini orcs or a whole separate species, the result is the same. The galaxy keeps turning. And somewhere, deep in the mud, something green is already growing. One of the most mind-blowing things about orcs, and honestly one of the most underappreciated aspects of their entire species, is that they don't just reproduce in the biological sense. They evolve through war. Their numbers multiply through spores, sure, but their capabilities, their roles, even their intelligence, all of that grows with violence. And not just on an individual level. We're talking about entire populations adapting through exposure to conflict. It's like war is their form of education, mutation, and ascension all rolled into one big green punch to the face. And here's where it gets really crazy. Orcs don't learn things in the traditional sense. They don't study, they don't train, they don't apprentice. They just know. A mech boy doesn't go to engineering school. He just pops out of the ground knowing how to slap together a kill cannon using a busted lasgun, a car battery, and some hope. A pain boy doesn't read anatomy texts. He just somehow understands that a knob's jawbone goes there and the squig bile stops the bleeding. It's instinct, but it's not dumb instinct. It's genetic memory. The best way I've heard it described is that orcs are like living USB drives. Every new orc carries forward the knowledge of battles fought by generations before, even if they don't realize it. It's not conscious, it's not poetic, it's just in them. This is why you can drop spores on a planet that's never seen an orc before, and within weeks you've got a functioning WAC with a tech-based chain of command, weapons, armor, and a teeth-based economy. They didn't invent any of that. It was waiting in the dirt. And here's the thing, the more war they experience, the more that knowledge base expands. As a bah grows, so does the quality of its soldiers. Boys become knobs, knobs become war bosses. Mechs start building more insane machines. Weird boys channel more psychic energy. Even the squigs start getting weirder. It's like every conflict becomes fuel for the species to push itself further. Not just to survive, but to escalate. Orcs don't stagnate, they escalate by default. What's really fascinating is how caste roles emerge seemingly out of nowhere. You don't need a mech to teach another mech. One just appears in the population when it's needed. Same with weird boys, pain boys, rundards, you name it. It's like their collective unconscious detects gaps in the system and fills them automatically. That's not evolution in the classic sense. That's ecosystem-level adaptation with a layer of shared psychic programming over the top. There's no planning, no leadership directing things. It just happens. And it always happens in just the right way to make the WAC stronger. Some fans think the orcs are actually a form of bioweapon left over from the war in heaven, and honestly, that makes a lot of sense. You don't engineer this kind of system by accident. You create it to be self-sustaining, self-replicating, and self-improving. The old ones, or whoever, didn't just make an army. They made an invasive, self-aware war species that could embed itself in any biosphere, absorb conflict like nutrients, and escalate infinitely. That's horrifying. That's genius. That's orcs. Others go even further and say orcs are the ecosystem. That they're not a species inside an environment, but the environment itself, fungal, psychic, and symbiotic. They fight not because they're mindless, but because that's how they function as a whole. Each boy is like a cell, a WAC is like an organ, and together they're one giant, angry, green organism sprawling across the galaxy, adapting through conflict, spreading through spores, and rebuilding itself over and over again. When you look at it that way, orcs aren't just another enemy, they're a biological event. And maybe that's the most terrifying part. You can't stop orcs by killing them. You can't reason with them, and you certainly can't outlast them, because even when you burn them, bury them, or nuke them from orbit, the spores remain. And when they come back, they'll be stronger, smarter, louder, because they learned something. Maybe not in the way we understand learning, but in their own way. And with every return, they push closer to that theoretical apex of orcdom. One endless wag that never truly ends, because it's not just a war. It's their life cycle, their evolution, their very being. The Tau are often seen as the reasonable species in the 40K universe. Clean armor, sleek tech, diplomacy before annihilation. But when you start digging into how they reproduce, things get a lot more complicated. At first glance, yeah, it's technically natural. They're biological beings. They have sexes, they form pair bonds, and they raise children. But that surface-level normality hides something way more controlled, way more engineered than most people realize. Because in the Tau Empire, even reproduction is a function of duty. You don't just have children because you fall in love. You have children because the greater good needs you to. And that idea, breeding for purpose, completely redefines what reproduction means for the Tau. From what we know, mating isn't forbidden or repressed. It's just structured. Partner selection isn't left up to romance or chaos. It's overseen, planned, even encouraged by the ethereal caste, who determine what pairings will best benefit society. There's no room for accidental pregnancies or emotional indulgence. Every new Tau life is a calculated addition to the whole. A resource. A future soldier, engineer, administrator, or diplomat. not a personal joy or legacy. The idea of genetic selection is where a lot of fans get uncomfortable, and I get it, because let's be honest, this starts sounding a lot like eugenics. Breeding partners chosen based on caste compatibility, physical and intellectual traits, even psychological profiles. That's not love, that's policy, and yeah, it's all in service to the greater good. But when the government decides who you can have kids with, it raises huge questions about personal freedom, if such a concept even exists in the Tau mindset. And honestly, maybe it doesn't. Maybe they've truly evolved past the need for personal choice in matters like reproduction. Or maybe they've just been conditioned to think they have. And then there's the caste system itself. The Tau Empire is rigidly divided into castes: fire, earth, water, air, and ethereal, and each one serves a distinct purpose in society. But that division isn't just social or occupational, it's biological. Over time, the castes have physically and mentally diverged. Fire caste Tau are stronger, more aggressive, built for combat. Water caste members are leaner, more adaptable, designed for diplomacy. Earth caste engineers are sturdy and analytical. And the air caste, those guys are practically alien compared to the others. Tall, fragile, bred for life in low-gravity environments. All of that implies selective breeding has already been happening for generations, maybe even centuries. Which brings up the big question, do all castes reproduce the same way? And the answer is, probably not. The physical differences are so significant that intercaste relationships might not even be feasible, biologically or socially. There are rumors that mating between castes is discouraged or outright forbidden. Not because of prejudice in the emotional sense, but because it dilutes the function of the offspring. A child born of a fire and earth caste union, for instance, might not be optimized for either role, so it's easier to just keep the bloodlines pure and the roles clean. Functional, efficient, and very, very cold. Of course, none of this is ever painted as sinister from the Tau perspective. In their eyes, this is enlightened, it's order. It's evolution working at the level of civilization. You don't let chance or emotion decide something as important as the future of your people. You guide it, shape it, ensure it thrives. And that's kind of the terrifying beauty of it, because they don't see themselves as oppressive. They see themselves as harmonious. Every child is born with a purpose, a direction, a contribution to make. And that's noble in a way. But it's also deeply unsettling. I've seen fans argue that the whole thing is a soft form of genetic programming, not through labs or artificial manipulation, though who knows what the ethereals are really hiding, but through social conditioning and selection pressure. You shape the society you want by shaping who's allowed to create the next generation. Over time, that creates a population that not only performs its assigned function well, but wants to. It believes in it. It sees no reason to question it. And that's where the real power lies, not in the genes, but in the mindset that those genes grow up inside. Is it better than the grimdark mess of the Imperium, where reproduction is often forced, weaponized, or ignored altogether? Maybe. The Tau don't brutalize their citizens. They don't treat childbirth as an afterthought or a punishment. They care, but they care in a way that feels manufactured. Like someone sat down, crunched the numbers, and decided what optimal reproduction should look like, and then turned it into national policy. So yeah, the Tau reproduced naturally. But nothing about their system feels natural. It feels like a species trying to perfect itself by removing every messy, emotional, spontaneous part of being alive, including love, including desire, including freedom. And maybe that works. For now. But you can't help wondering what happens if a Tau ever does fall in love across caste lines or chooses to have a child without approval. Would that child be shunned, silenced, or worse, never allowed to exist at all? If there's one thing you start to notice the deeper you look into Tau society, it's how thoroughly the state has embedded itself into every layer of life. And nowhere is that more obvious or more unsettling than in how they handle reproduction. For the Tau, creating life isn't a personal journey. It's not sacred, emotional, or even particularly private. It's a civic responsibility, carried out not out of desire, but out of duty to the greater good. And that phrase, the greater good, shows up everywhere when it comes to how they manage who gets to breed, when, and with whom. It's pretty clear that the ethereal caste holds a huge amount of influence over the reproductive policies of the Empire. They're the spiritual and political leaders of the Tau, and while they don't rule with overt tyranny, their word is absolute. From what we've seen, they don't need brute force. Their presence alone is enough to ensure obedience, so when they guide reproductive pairing, either through subtle cultural norms or direct regulation, no one questions it. It's not framed as control. It's framed as harmony, unity, logic, and that makes it all the more insidious. Relationships between castes, for example, are a huge point of speculation and quiet controversy in the lore. There's a widespread belief that intercaste breeding is either heavily discouraged or outright forbidden, not because of cultural animosity, but because it disrupts functional clarity. Every caste has a purpose, and children born of mixed lineage might not fit cleanly into any role. And the Tau don't like uncertainty. A fire caste warrior knows what he is. A water caste diplomat knows her place. But a hybrid? That's a wild card, and wild cards aren't useful to a society that runs on predictability and efficiency. Some fans even theorize that there are active reproductive programs in place, state-run pairings chosen based on optimal gene matches, caste needs, and population data. These wouldn't be enforced with guns or prisons, but with incentives, cultural pressure, and subtle exclusion. If you fall in love with someone outside your caste, you're not punished, you're just forgotten, left out of promotions, kept from opportunities, quietly reminded that you've stepped off the path. And if you do manage to have a child that doesn't align with caste expectations, maybe they're reassigned, or maybe they're never given the chance to develop at all. It's cold, but it's effective. Then there's the question of resources. In a system this structured, child rearing isn't a private affair, it's an extension of state planning. The government allocates housing, education, medical care, and social roles from the moment a child is registered. There's probably no such thing as surprise pregnancy in Tau society. Everything is timed, measured, supported. It sounds ideal on paper. No child is unwanted, no family is left to struggle. But the cost of that order is freedom. You don't choose to become a parent. You are designated one. It also raises a deeper, creepier question. Is Tau loyalty innate? Are they just raised to obey the ethereals? Or is there something more going on under the surface? Some theories, especially from fans who lean into the darker interpretations of Tau society, suggest there might be genetic tampering involved. That loyalty isn't just taught, but engineered. Not through full-on mind control, but through generations of selection. Favoring compliance, encouraging docility, breeding out rebellion. After enough cycles, you end up with a population that doesn't just serve the state, it believes in it, instinctively and unshakably. It's not that far-fetched when you consider how stable the Tau Empire is compared to the rest of the galaxy. You don't see uprisings, you don't hear about civil wars. Even with all the propaganda and caste rigidity, there's this eerie calm to it all. Either the Tau are genuinely that united, or they've been built to be. And when you start thinking of them less as a society and more as a long-term breeding program, guided by near-immortal ethereals, it all starts to make a lot more sense, and a lot more terrifying. To some, it's admirable, a society that avoids the chaos of passion and impulse. A system that ensures every child is born with purpose, supported, guided, and destined to serve something larger than themselves. But to others, it's dystopian in the most subtle way possible. There are no shackles, but there are no choices either. Everything is clean, sterile, and perfectly aligned with the greater good, including reproduction. So while the Tau might seem progressive on the surface, the way they handle life and its creation reveals a truth that's much more complicated. They haven't escaped the horrors of 40K. They've just optimized them. There's something both inspiring and ominous about the way the Tau Empire continues to expand. On the surface, they seem like the only ones in the galaxy trying to build something that resembles peace, offering alliances, accepting alien species, spreading the greater good not just through conquest, but through integration. But the deeper you dig, the more you start to realize that their unity comes at a steep cost. Because the more they absorb other races, the more they risk losing the very thing that makes them Tau. And nowhere is that tension more fragile than in the realm of reproduction. The Tau have always been about structure, caste divisions, social order, genetic purpose. Every part of their society is built to work like a machine. But what happens when you start mixing in alien parts? As the empire grows and absorbs more species, Kroot, Vespid, Nicassar, even some renegade humans, it becomes harder and harder to keep that internal harmony intact. Cultural differences can be managed with diplomacy and propaganda, but genetics? That's a much more complicated threat. You don't see much in the lore about Tau interbreeding with other species, and there's probably a good reason for that. From a biological standpoint, it's likely not possible in most cases. But that hasn't stopped fans from speculating. The big question people keep asking is, what happens if it becomes possible? Whether through science, psychic tampering, or even just long-term hybridization, what if a future exists where Tau and other species can reproduce together? It's not just a sci-fi what-if anymore, it's a political crisis waiting to happen. Because the Tau have spent millennia crafting a society based on purity, not in a xenophobic or supremacist way, but in a functional one. Fire caste is for warriors, earth caste is for builders. Everyone has a place, genetically and socially. Introducing hybrid offspring into that system throws the whole model into chaos. A child born of a Tau and, say, a Kroot wouldn't fit into any caste. They'd be outside the structure, outside the plan. And that's the kind of disorder the Tau Empire is fundamentally not equipped to handle. Some fans theorize that this is already happening behind the scenes, that the ethereals, in their endless pursuit of unity, are researching ways to bridge the genetic gap between species. Not because they want to encourage love between species, but because it would make integration easier. Imagine being able to create a hybrid diplomat, part Tau and part whatever species the Empire's trying to win over this decade. They wouldn't just speak the culture, they'd be it. It's a compelling idea, but it's also deeply risky, because it invites the question, where does Tau end and the other begin? And then you have to wonder, could genetic evolution itself threaten the caste system? The physical distinctions between castes didn't just appear overnight. They were shaped through generations of selection and reinforcement. But if the Tau keep expanding, keep mixing cultures, ideas, and possibly bloodlines, those distinctions could begin to blur. A fire caste Tau who inherits diplomatic cunning from a water parent. An earth caste youth born with unexpected aggression. Over time, the rigid divisions start to melt. And with them, the control that has kept the Empire stable for so long. That's the paradox of unity. The Tau want to bring the galaxy together under one ideal. But to do that, they have to open themselves up to change. And change, by its nature, is uncontrollable. Once genetic diversity enters the system, once social roles begin to cross-pollinate, the machinery of the caste system starts to jam. What was once a clean, well-oiled society starts to evolve into something messier, more organic, and perhaps more human. There are people who think that's exactly what the ethereals fear, that if the population ever becomes too diverse, too unpredictable, they'll lose their subtle grip over the hearts and minds of the Tau. Because their control isn't enforced through terror, it's maintained through belief. Belief in order, in purpose, in the greater good. But what happens when that belief collides with new perspectives, new desires, even new kinds of love? And yeah, it's easy to dismiss all this as distant speculation. The Tau are still in control, their reproductive policies are working, their society is stable. But if we've learned anything from 40K, it's that even the most stable empires crack eventually. Whether from war, corruption, or something as seemingly harmless as a child born of two different worlds. It might not happen tomorrow. It might not happen in 10 generations. But the seeds are there. The Tau are reaching outward, drawing in the galaxy, spreading their message. And in doing so, they're planting the potential for something new, something they can't fully predict or control. A future where the Tau might still exist, but not in the form they intended. A future shaped not just by doctrine or genetics, but by evolution. True evolution. There's something beautifully horrific about the way Tyranids reproduce. I mean, sure, every species in the galaxy has their own weird, often terrifying system of survival. But the Tyranids? They don't just survive, they consume, they erase, and then they become something new. They don't have parents, they don't have offspring. There's no legacy, no family, no sense of continuity in any emotional or social way. What they have is biomass, raw organic material, ripped from whatever unfortunate planet they land on, and they reshape it into whatever the hive mind decides is necessary next. When we talk about Tyranid reproduction, we're not talking about two creatures mating and producing a child. We're talking about entire ecosystems being broken down into nutrient soup, then repurposed into biological weapons. Think about that. A planet full of people, animals, forests, microbes, every bit of organic matter is just fuel for the next wave of the swarm. It's not even death in the traditional sense. It's repurposing. Nothing is wasted. Everything is recycled. And that cycle is endless. The process starts with harvesters, creatures like rippers, feeder organisms, and capillary towers that begin breaking down biomass and sending it back into digestion pools. These pools are often acidic, massive lakes that churn with liquefied DNA, protein, fat, and everything else that once made up life on the planet. It's all broken down at the molecular level. And from that slurry, the hive mind constructs its next generation. Gaunts, Genestealers, Carnifexes, you name it. None of them were born in the way we understand it. They were grown, engineered with a specific role in mind, based on what the hive mind thinks it needs most right now. And the scariest part? It works. The hive mind can adjust its designs on the fly. Let's say it sends in a batch of gaunts and they get shredded by heavy armor. Next time, it grows more with reinforced carapaces or builds something completely new like a Tyrannifex or exocrine. There's no gap between need and creation. There's no downtime. As long as there's biomass to consume, the swarm keeps adapting, keeps building, keeps reproducing. That's why fans sometimes describe Tyranid reproduction not as a biological act, but as a function. There's no parent, no individuality, no lineage. There's just purpose. Every creature is born for a task, whether it's digestion, destruction, or deployment. And when that task is complete, or the organism fails, it's just recycled again. Returned to the pools, broken down, and used to grow something else. It's disturbingly efficient. There's no waste, no ego, just pure, terrifying pragmatism. One idea I've always loved, which pops up in fan circles a lot, is that every Tyranid organism is, in a way, a reincarnation of the worlds they've consumed. Not in a spiritual sense, of course, but literally. The muscle tissue in a hormigaunt might come from cattle, its claws from jungle predators. Its nervous system, strangely enough, could have once belonged to a human child. Everything becomes everything else. Each new creature is a biological collage of entire civilizations. You look at a swarm, and you're not just seeing Tyranids, you're seeing what they've taken. Planets reduced to monsters, and yet, despite how alien all this is, it makes a weird kind of sense. The hive mind doesn't care about identity. It doesn't mourn. It doesn't remember. It only hungers. And from that hunger, it builds. Reproduction for the Tyranids is just one part of a larger metabolic cycle. Feed, grow, adapt, repeat. They don't need love. They don't need connection. They need raw material and a reason to use it. And as long as the galaxy keeps giving them both, they'll never stop multiplying. I've seen some people try to argue that the Tyranids aren't really alive in the conventional sense, and in some ways I agree. They're more like a process, a moving storm of biology, a living equation designed to optimize itself endlessly. Every new generation is a response, a reply to resistance. That's not just reproduction, it's evolution weaponized into a reproductive strategy. The swarm doesn't need time to grow stronger. It just eats something smarter and becomes stronger immediately. So yeah, Tyranid reproduction isn't romantic or emotional or even personal. It's cosmic-level resource management, a deathless engine of consumption and transformation. Every time they devour a planet, they're not just feeding, they're preparing. Every digestion pool is a womb, and every battle is a lesson. They reproduce not to create life, but to perfect destruction. And the worst part is, they're getting better at it, every single time. The thing about Tyranids that keeps gnawing at me, beyond the claws, the teeth, and the literal planet-eating, is that they don't reproduce in any way that feels remotely familiar. There are no mothers, no fathers, no nests or tender moments. There's just hunger. Tyranids reproduce by devouring life, breaking it down into the most basic organic components, and then using that biomass to build something new, something twisted, lethal, and perfectly adapted for the next target. It's not creation, it's recycling on a galactic scale, and it's not random. Every part of it is by design. When a Tyranid fleet invades a planet, it doesn't just destroy for the sake of it. Every organism on that world, human, xeno, flora, fauna, is harvested. The swarm sends out organisms like rippers and other feeder beasts, biological vacuum cleaners that tear everything down to the bone. All of that organic matter is sent back to digestion pools, massive seething lakes of acid and enzymes that melt the living and the dead alike into thick nutrient broth. And from that bubbling horror, the hive mind builds its next wave of monsters. There's something chillingly perfect about it. No waste, no emotion, no individuality. The hive mind sees a world, consumes it, and reconfigures what it's taken into whatever form suits its needs. Genestealers, hormogods, biovores, even massive creatures like hierodules, all of them are born not from parents, but from this grotesque act of transformation. You don't raise a Tyranid. You don't nurture one. You design it, build it, and unleash it. Every creature is a tool, and once that tool is broken or no longer useful, it gets thrown back into the biomass to become something else. Fans have often described this as a kind of biomass alchemy, and I really love that term. It captures the essence of what Tyranids do. It's not just destruction, it's a twisted form of creation, one based entirely on loss. Every new creature is a living monument to a world that no longer exists. That lictor might carry within it the genetic traces of an entire continent's worth of life. That carnifex might owe its bulk to millions of lives, dissolved into their base components. In a sick, poetic way, each new Tyranid is the world it consumed. There's no lineage here, no bloodline to trace. One hormigaunt doesn't descend from another. It's just the next iteration. The hive mind doesn't care about individuality or legacy. It doesn't even operate on that level. It sees everything in terms of utility. A dead hive tyrant is not a tragedy. It's a design note, an opportunity to improve, to adapt. Its biomass is recovered and its genetic data filed into whatever will come next. That's how you get those terrifying hybrid units that start showing up mid-campaign. Bioforms that didn't exist before, but now do, because you gave the hive something new to work with. And honestly, that's what makes them such a terrifying existential threat. They don't just kill, they learn. Every world they consume is not just fuel, but research. Every life form they break down becomes part of the swarm's growing understanding of what works, what doesn't, and what can be weaponized. It's not reproduction the way we think of it. It's more like a continual feedback loop of harvest, analysis, and refinement. It's also why Tyranid fleets don't always look the same. Each one carries the evolutionary imprint of the worlds it's consumed. You can sometimes tell what kind of enemies a fleet has faced before just by looking at its organisms. If it's fought a lot of mechanized forces, you'll see more armor, more anti-vehicle bioforms. If it's battled psychic enemies, you might see increased numbers of zoanthropes or shadow in the warp effects. Every creature is a reflection of what came before, and in that way, reproduction becomes memory. The swarm remembers, not through thought or emotion, but through flesh. Some fans go even further and say that Tyranid reproduction is a kind of resurrection, not of individuals, but of planets. A kind of horrifying reincarnation where entire biospheres are reborn as beasts of war. That a world consumed by the hive mind never truly dies, it just gets reassembled into something stronger, faster, deadlier. And that idea sticks with you, because it means every time you see a Tyranid swarm, you're not just looking at an army. You're looking at the remains of 100 dead civilizations, melted down and turned into the perfect weapon. So yeah, Tyranids reproduce. But not like anything else in the galaxy. There's no love, no intimacy, no joy. Just an endless, grotesque cycle of consumption and rebirth. And as long as there are worlds left to devour, the swarm will keep growing. One horrifying, efficient monstrosity at a time. One of the questions that keeps coming up when people talk about Tyranids is this. Can they actually go extinct? I mean, sure, you can destroy a hive fleet. You can glass a planet before they land. You can even pull off a miracle and fight them back in a major campaign. But the deeper you understand how Tyranids operate, the more it starts to feel like those victories are just delays, setbacks, scratches on the surface of something much bigger. Because Tyranids don't rely on traditional genetic reproduction. There are no parents, no breeding cycles, no eggs or infants. Everything they are is a result of pure, relentless bioengineering. That's what makes them so terrifying. They don't reproduce, they manufacture. Each creature isn't a random result of genetic lottery. It's grown, purpose-built, and tailored by the hive mind. And when a unit is lost in combat, that information doesn't just disappear. It gets absorbed, processed, and recycled. The biomass returns to the digestion pools, and from the broken bodies of defeated organisms, new, improved forms emerge. It's not just reproduction, it's iteration. You didn't kill a Tyranid, you beta-tested it. This cycle of self-renewal is what makes them feel functionally immortal. A hive fleet doesn't just bring soldiers, it brings the tools to grow more. As long as there's biomass, even enemy corpses, they can rebuild. Even when they lose, they win. The galaxy is their resource pool, and they're not running out anytime soon. Planets are everywhere. Organics are everywhere. And as long as that's true, extinction doesn't even seem like a real possibility. Some fans like to joke that Tyranids are less like a species and more like a living software program that can't be uninstalled. And I get that. Their reproductive process is closer to running an endless update than giving birth. And this leads to one of the most persistent and intriguing fan theories. The idea of a central reproductive core, a mega-organism or facility at the heart of the galactic hive that's constantly pumping out new bioforms. Some call it the prime incubator. Others imagine it as a living god machine, buried deep in the void beyond the galactic rim. The idea is that even if every known hive fleet were destroyed, this source could just send out more, rebuilt from scratch, using data harvested from past encounters. We don't have confirmation on this, but it makes a terrifying amount of sense. Hive fleets that have never been in contact with each other still show coordinated evolution. That suggests a shared intelligence, a shared purpose, and probably a shared point of origin. Whatever that origin is, it's still out there, and it's still thinking, still watching, still adapting. So could the Tyranids ever be fully wiped out? Technically, maybe. If the galaxy somehow united every force, closed off every planet, and sterilized every potential biomass source, they might be contained. But realistically, that's science fantasy. The galaxy is chaos. Empires rise and fall, and Tyranids wait. Even a single spore, left unnoticed on a forgotten moon, can start the cycle again. And with every new outbreak, they get smarter, faster, deadlier. Another layer to this is how little we actually know about the limits of their bioengineering. Is there a cap on what the hive mind can create? Have we seen its full range of forms? Honestly, probably not. It keeps surprising us. New strains, new abilities, even creatures we thought had limits turn out to have terrifying upgrades. What's stopping them from creating something even worse than a dominatrix or a hierophant? What happens when they decide to build something specifically to target psychers or to infiltrate imperial command structures? Nothing, really. There are no ethical boundaries, no cultural restraints. The only limit is biomass and imagination, and the hive mind has plenty of both. That's what makes the Tyranids such a unique terror in 40K. They're not here to conquer. They don't care about ruling. They don't want to enslave you. They just want to consume you, break you down, and turn you into the next stage of their existence. You don't beat them by resisting. You just slow them down. And even that might feed into their greater plan. Every fight, every defense, every desperate attempt to survive, it all teaches them more. And the next time, they'll be ready. So no, I don't think Tyranids can truly go extinct, not unless something takes out their central intelligence, the true heart of the hive mind, wherever or whatever that may be. And even then, who's to say another one wouldn't evolve from what's left? They're not just a species, they're a process, a living apocalypse. And that process doesn't end, it adapts. Demiurg have always been one of those races that sit just on the edge of the known, mentioned in passing, occasionally glimpsed but never fully explored. And that mystery only fuels the obsession. We know they exist. We know they mine, forge, and trade. We know the Tau respect them. But when it comes to their biology, how they live, how they age, and especially how they reproduce, we're left with a swirling cloud of hints, speculation, and fan theory. And honestly, that makes them even more compelling. From what little is confirmed in the lore, Demiurg are a squat, sturdy, highly intelligent Xenos race known for their technological mastery and deep space mining operations. Physically, they resemble what many fans immediately associate with dwarves: short, tough, bearded, and heavily gear-oriented. That's led to tons of comparisons with the squats of old, and even more recently, the Leagues of Votann. Are they related? Possibly. Are they the same? Maybe not. The Leagues have been developed into a full faction, with their own culture and genetic lore, while the Demiurg remain shrouded in vagueness. But still, the similarities are hard to ignore. One of the more pressing biological questions that gets tossed around is about sex and reproduction. We've only ever seen male-presenting Demiurg. There are no records, no miniatures, no artworks depicting clearly female Demiurg. That alone has opened the floodgates of theory. Do they have biological sexes at all? Or is their reproductive strategy entirely different from what we're used to? Some fans suggest they might be sexually dimorphic in more subtle ways. Maybe females look almost identical to males, or maybe they just aren't seen outside private, protected environments. Others believe reproduction might not even be sexual anymore. That the Demiurg, being such a highly advanced and insular species, may have moved beyond it. That's where the theory of artificial reproduction comes in. Cloning is a big topic among Demiurg fans, especially when you consider their technological prowess. If any species could perfect reproductive cloning for stability, genetic precision, and cultural continuity, it would be them. Think about it. You're a star-faring mining race living in hostile voids for centuries, surrounded by danger and isolated from the broader galaxy. Relying on unpredictable biological reproduction might be seen as inefficient or risky. So instead, maybe you standardize your offspring. You select for intelligence, durability, technical skill. You create generations of engineers who are not just trained, but built to be better. There's also the possibility that Demiurg biology is simply incredibly slow. Maybe they do reproduce biologically, but at a pace we'd find agonizingly glacial. Long lifespans, slow maturity, and low birth rates would explain why we see so few of them, and why their population remains small despite their evident power. This would fit with a cultural emphasis on quality over quantity, which seems to align well with their stoic, methodical nature. Some fans even go deeper into speculative territory, suggesting that Demiurg might not be purely organic anymore. That over the millennia, they've augmented themselves so thoroughly that traditional reproduction has become irrelevant. Instead, they might grow new bodies in forge vats, implanting minds copied or cultivated from older generations. That's not immortality, exactly, but it is a kind of legacy that skips the messiness of evolution. It would also explain the total absence of anything resembling youth culture or family dynamics in the fragments of Demiurg lore we have. And then there's the philosophical angle. Demiurg culture seems deeply tied to industry, to legacy, to the passing on of knowledge through work. It wouldn't be surprising if reproduction in their minds isn't about biology at all. It's about contribution. You don't create life for the sake of it. You bring someone into being when there's a need, a purpose, a function. That mentality alone would fundamentally reshape how they view family, identity, and the future. But again, this is all speculation, and that's what makes the Demiurg so fascinating. They're a blank slate with just enough detail to get your imagination racing. Are they ancient clones maintaining a dying culture? Are they slow-breeding void dwellers guarding their secrets like precious ore? Or are they post-biological beings who have reinvented the very idea of what reproduction means? Nobody knows for sure, but whatever the truth is, you can bet it's not something as simple or as human as love and childbirth. For the Demiurg, it's probably something far colder and far more deliberate. What's always struck me about the Demiurg isn't just their mystery, it's the context in which they exist. They don't live on worlds, they don't have sprawling cities, planetary capitals, or fertile plains. They dwell in voidcraft, massive, fortified mining vessels drifting through deep space. That kind of lifestyle changes everything, especially when it comes to reproduction. Because without planets, without seasons or natural ecosystems, creating new life becomes a conscious, resource-heavy decision. You don't just have a child, you build a future crew member. And in a society like that, every birth is more than biological. It's cultural, strategic, and sacred in its own quiet way. Living in total isolation means the Demiurg can't afford waste. Every nutrient, every cycle of oxygen, every cubic meter of habitat is accounted for. That alone suggests their reproductive system, whatever it is slow, precise, and heavily regulated. In such a tightly controlled environment, even a small population boom could collapse the entire system. Which is why a lot of fans think Demiurg reproduction might be limited by artificial quotas. Maybe it's not the individual who decides to reproduce at all. Maybe it's the collective, clan leaders, or governing AI systems who decide when and how new members are added. And that leads to one of the most common theories: artificial reproduction. Some imagine in vitro fertilization programs managed on massive, sterile biolabs inside their ships. Others go even further, suggesting complete decoupling from sex altogether, with reproduction handled by genomic engineering, maybe even CRISPR-like technology taken to an extreme. Genetic banks would ensure diversity, traits could be fine-tuned, and births would be scheduled, predictable, and efficient. It's cold, but in an environment where a single hull breach could kill half your population, it's probably necessary. But what really fascinates me is the cultural side. Imagine growing up on a ship that's been moving through deep space for generations. There's no sunrises, no seasons, no holidays tied to nature. Everything you learn comes from machines, from tradition, from knowledge passed down like code. In that setting, a child wouldn't just be a new life, they'd be a legacy, a carrier of memory, a future master artisan, trained from the moment they're born to honor the work of those who came before. That's why many fans speculate that Demiurg children, however rare they are likely raised not by parents in the nuclear family sense, but by entire clans. Educated communally, trained with precision, forged with care. There's also the genetic diversity issue, and that's where things get really interesting. A small, isolated population faces genetic bottlenecking over time. In human terms, that leads to inbreeding, loss of adaptability, and increased susceptibility to disease. But for the Demiurg, maybe they've solved that. Maybe they supplement their gene pool with artificial gene sequences or preserve genomes from ancient archives. Maybe they share genetic material between different void clans to maintain variety. Some even think they might integrate foreign DNA, not randomly but selectively, using xenogenetic data to strengthen weak traits or introduce resilience. And that opens up another theory. Perhaps reproduction among the Demiurg isn't just about maintaining numbers, but improving function. If you need a new generation of engineers, you don't just wait for someone to fall in love. You construct a genetic template optimized for precision, patience, and neural efficiency. If your fleet needs a better pilot, maybe you select for enhanced reflexes or spatial awareness. It's not so much eugenics as it is intentionality. Life created with a clear role in mind. A kind of biological craftsmanship that mirrors their metalworking traditions. Still, it's worth wondering what that does to individuality. If every child is shaped by design, raised by the collective, and trained to fit a role, do they even want anything beyond that? Is there room for rebellion, deviation, creativity? Or has their society evolved past those questions? Maybe the Demiurg don't see reproduction as something you choose at all. It's just another function, like forging plasma coils or charting a new asteroid belt. And that's where the culture and the biology blur into one. The void isn't a place that forgives weakness. It's not romantic. It's not emotional. It's pure survival, and the Demiurg, by all accounts, have embraced that reality completely. Whatever their reproductive methods are, they're undoubtedly shaped by this logic. There's no randomness, no abundance, only deliberate continuity. Every new life is a calculated flame lit in the darkness, tended carefully by those who understand just how fragile it is and how vital. So while we don't know exactly how Demiurg reproduce, we know what kind of world that reproduction exists within. A world of silence, precision, and enduring legacy. A place where every child isn't just born, they're forged. If there's one thing that feels unmistakably central to the Demiurg, more than mining, more than forging, more than even their mysterious alliance with the Tia, it's legacy. Everything we've seen and guessed about them points toward a culture obsessed not just with surviving, but with preserving. Not in a static, museum-like way, but through continuity. Of skill, of knowledge, of precision. And that's where reproduction for the Demiurg starts to look less like a biological function and more like a cultural ritual. A lot of us who speculate on Demiurg society have wondered whether they pass down knowledge genetically. And sure, in the Warhammer 40K universe, It's not that far-fetched. There are species that encode instincts into their DNA. But with the Demiurg, it feels like they would favor something more intentional. Knowledge to them isn't just data to be transferred, it's craft. It's a sacred inheritance, and that means it has to be taught, shaped, molded like metal under pressure. If a Demiurg child is born, or more likely, approved into being, they're not handed a set of instructions from their ancestors' genes. They're placed under the care of mentors, given tools, immersed in centuries-old methods. The Forge teaches what flesh cannot. There's a theory that among the Demiurg, to raise a child is to forge a new generation of artisans. That each newborn is assigned to a master, not just to learn a trade, but to carry on a lineage of creation. And that's where reproduction becomes something far more poetic. Because it's not just about creating bodies, it's about preserving methods. A child doesn't just inherit a family name, they inherit the weight of perfected craft. Every bolt they tighten, every alloy they refine, is a continuation of someone else's life's work. That's what gives meaning to their existence in the void. They're not just maintaining a civilization, they're engraving it into the future, one rivet at a time. This brings us to the idea that, for the Demiurg, actual birth might not even be the most important part of reproduction. Instead, the true act of creating new life could be the transmission of knowledge, apprenticeship, instruction. Even cloning or artificial reproduction, if it exists, would only be the beginning. What truly matters is what happens after, the molding of a soul through discipline, through mastery, through purpose. That's why some fans believe Demiurg society is less about raising children and more about training successors. You can feel this cultural weight in everything implied about them. Their reluctance to expand rapidly, their focus on quality over numbers, the idea that one well-trained Demiurg is worth 100 lesser workers. It's not about populating ships with as many bodies as possible. It's about ensuring that every individual matters, that they contribute meaningfully, that their presence isn't just tolerated, but necessary. In this way, their approach to reproduction is almost the opposite of the Tau or the Tyranids. Those species expand to serve a system. The Demiurg build the system around those worthy of expanding it. And when you think about it, that mindset might actually discourage rapid population growth. If you treat every new life as an investment of time, of teaching, of tradition, then you only create when you're ready to commit. You don't breed for numbers, you breed for craftsmen. That makes their society feel smaller, tighter, more deliberate, and honestly, more fragile in some ways. If too many are lost, it's not just lives that disappear, it's skills, techniques, generations of process that can't be simply reconstructed from a database or blueprint. I've always liked the idea that Demiurg don't even think of themselves as growing. Not really. Their goal isn't to outnumber anyone or spread across 100 systems, it's to endure. To carry something ancient through the dark from one century to the next. If they reproduce, it's not because they can, but because something within their cultural matrix tells them, now is the time. Now is when we need another hand on the anvil, another mind to solve the next equation, another voice to hum the old psalms in the engine decks. In that sense, their children are born twice. Once in body, and once again when they prove themselves at the forge. And that second birth, the one shaped by sweat, knowledge, and purpose, is the one that truly matters. The thing that makes the Kroot so utterly fascinating, and honestly so underrated, is that their reproduction doesn't just serve to grow their numbers. It's their primary tool for evolution. These guys don't just eat to live, they eat to change, to become. Every feast, every battlefield corpse they consume has the potential to shape what the next generation of Kroot will be. It's like reproduction and evolution are part of the same loop, and it makes them one of the most unpredictable species in the entire galaxy. At their core, Kroot biology is this beautiful horror of genetic adaptability. Their bodies don't just digest flesh, they break it down on a genetic level and store the information. When a Kroot eats something, especially something intelligent or strong, it's not just nutrition, it's raw code. That code is then used to subtly or significantly alter the genetic structure of their offspring. That's the twist. Their kids don't just inherit traits from their parents, they inherit from everything their parents ate. Imagine what that does to the concept of lineage. This is where it gets tricky. Because the Kroot are walking a biological tightrope. One bad feast, one poorly chosen DNA source, and you don't just get sick, you compromise the next generation. That's why Shapers, the elders and guides of Kroot kindreds, are so crucial. They don't just lead hunts or tell stories. They are the genetic stewards of their people. It's the Shaper who decides what's safe to eat, what's beneficial, and what's forbidden. And that power is massive. It turns nutrition into something deeply cultural, even spiritual. Because if you follow the wrong Shaper, you might not just ruin your kindred, you might doom your entire bloodline. And yes, Kroot reproduce biologically in the traditional sense, but that's not really where the magic happens. It's what comes before reproduction that makes the difference. Mating might be the spark, but the fire comes from digestion. The child is born of flesh, sure, but the shape of that child is born of everything that came before. That's why fans often refer to the process as evolutionary reproduction. It's not random, and it's not slow. It's intentional, and when done correctly, it's terrifyingly efficient. There's a popular theory among lore fans that Kroot could, in theory, design entire new subspecies through careful, multi-generational dietary planning. You want stronger warriors? Feed your breeding groups orc meat, or maybe Ogren if you can get it. You want stealth specialists? Maybe go for Eldar scouts or camouflaging creatures from death worlds. Over time, traits accumulate and specialize. It's like biological modding. And considering how often we see unique Kroot variants like Kroot hounds or Krootoks, this theory doesn't feel far-fetched. It feels inevitable. But that raises a chilling thought. If they can do this intentionally, why haven't they done more? Why isn't there an empire of hyper-evolved Kroot subraces ruling entire systems? Some people think it's because they have limits, genetic instability maybe, or cultural restraints. Others believe the Shapers deliberately hold back, fearing that if they push too far, the Kroot might lose themselves completely. After all, when your identity is shaped by what you eat, how do you stay you? And yet, we know Kroot have dabbled in dangerous consumption. They've eaten chaos-corrupted flesh before and suffered for it. They've eaten psychers, Xenos, mutants, sometimes gaining power, sometimes spiraling into madness or mutation. That's the cost of adaptability. You become what you consume. And if what you consume is twisted, so are you. That's probably why Kroot society remains so cautious despite their potential. One mistake doesn't just affect an individual, it alters the legacy of an entire kindred. Still, it's hard not to imagine what's possible. In the right hands, or beaks, their evolutionary potential is insane. Imagine Kroot deliberately crafting a new caste of warriors to counter a specific enemy. Psyker-resistant breeds for Tyranid encounters, urban-adapted forms for hive warfare, aquatic strains for underwater colonies. The possibilities are endless. And if that kind of long-game thinking ever became widespread in Kroot culture, the rest of the galaxy might have to take them a whole lot more seriously. In the end, Kroot reproduction isn't about love, passion, or even survival in the emotional sense. It's about purpose. It's about building the future one bite at a time. Their children are living proof of their experiences, living echoes of the battlefields they've fought on and the enemies they've overcome. It's brutal, it's elegant, and it's one of the most alien, yet effective systems of inheritance in the entire setting. You are what you eat, and your kids are too. The more I dive into Kroot culture, the more I realize that what they call family isn't anything like the human concept of it. There's no nuclear unit, no clear mom and dad dynamic, no cozy household where kids are raised with bedtime stories and birthday parties. But that doesn't mean they don't have something just as powerful, or maybe even more powerful. What the Kroot have is kindred, a deeply interconnected clan system that blends biology, tradition, survival, and a fierce sense of legacy. And it's through this structure that they pass on everything. Bloodlines, knowledge, language, and the very essence of what it means to be Kroot. From what we know, individual parentage isn't particularly emphasized in Kroot society. Offspring are seen not as the children of two, but as the future of many. The entire kindred takes part in raising them. It's communal, almost tribal in the purest sense. Everyone contributes, and everyone shapes the next generation, not just through genes and food, but through memory, stories, and ritual. That alone says a lot about how they view reproduction. It's not just about continuing a line, it's about continuing a people. And at the heart of all of this are the Shapers. These aren't just leaders. They're not just generals or wise elders. They're the keepers of genetic fate and spiritual direction. A Shaper isn't just someone who tells the kindred what to eat to maintain their traits. They're the one who decides what kind of people the kindred will become. Their decisions affect the biological shape of future generations, yes, but also the cultural shape. They pass down ancestral knowledge, preserve oral traditions, and guide the philosophical identity of their kindred. In many ways, a Shaper is closer to a parent than the actual biological contributors to a child's existence. This makes kindreds not just social units, but reproductive and educational units too. Each one has its own flavor, its own traditions, genetic tendencies, even dialects. Some might be warlike, others more stealthy, some even inclined toward crafting or negotiation, depending on their ancestral diet and the paths their Shapers have chosen. That means reproduction isn't just physical, it's an act of identity. To be born into a kindred is to inherit a role, a direction, and a purpose. You're not just someone's child, you're part of a living, breathing lineage of flesh and memory. What I find especially fascinating is how the young are taught. There's no formal schooling, no standardized curriculum. Instead, the youth learn through osmosis, absorbing behavior, skill, and values from their elders as they hunt, build, fight, and eat alongside them. And this isn't limited to survival skills. Language is passed down orally, reinforced by ritual, chants, and storytelling. It's layered, dense, and deeply tied to their cultural view of flesh and memory. To forget a word might be to forget a victory, a mistake, or even a warning encoded generations ago. Some fans like to think of Kroot society as a living, evolving archive, that every kindred is a different volume in a constantly updating library. The genetic code is one kind of information, sure, but the spoken word, the learned behavior, the way they cook or mourn or celebrate, that's another kind of inheritance. And just as sacred. There's something beautifully primal about that. No machines, no implants, just memory carried in the blood and the breath. Another thing that stands out is how reproduction is never seen as a right. It's a responsibility, sometimes even a reward. Not everyone may be allowed to pass on their genes, especially if their consumption history is considered too unstable or risky. In some interpretations, only those who've proven themselves in service to the kindred are permitted to contribute to the next generation, ensuring both physical and cultural strength. It's a subtle but powerful form of quality control, enforced not by law, but by deeply rooted tradition. There's also this recurring fan theory that Shapers might selectively direct not just the diet of the kindred, but the mating patterns as well. If mating is even the right word in a society that's so collective in nature. Maybe certain pairings are encouraged based on their lineage's consistency, adaptability, or resilience, not out of romance or attraction, but out of strategic preservation. You don't just mate with someone because you like them, you do it because your offspring will carry forward the kindred in a way that matters. In the end, Kroot reproduction is deeply tied to their collective identity. It's not about individual legacy, it's about kindred continuity. Their young are raised by many, shaped by diet, molded by story, and guided by a figure who embodies both past and future. It's a system that feels raw and wild, but is actually incredibly sophisticated beneath the surface. They don't just pass on genes, they pass on purpose. They don't just make new Kroot, they forge them, from flesh, memory, and meaning. What makes the Kroot so endlessly fascinating is also what makes them incredibly vulnerable. Their genetic fluidity. The very trait that allows them to adapt, to evolve rapidly through selective consumption, is also a ticking time bomb. Because with every feast comes a risk. Every bite taken from a new creature, every decision to incorporate foreign DNA into the kindred's future carries the chance of disaster. It's like playing genetic roulette with the soul of your species, and it doesn't always go well. We know the Kroot change based on what they consume. That's their thing. Eat orcs, get tougher. Eat Aeldari, maybe pick up some speed or heightened reflexes. But not every trait is desirable, and not every DNA strand plays nice with the Kroot template. There are whispered stories of kindreds who grew too fast, too unstable, who indulged in the wrong meat and paid the price with irreversible mutation. Some became grotesque, misshapen things, losing their Kroot form entirely. Others lost their minds, descending into feral states or exhibiting erratic, uncontrollable behaviors that made them dangerous not just to others but to themselves. There's even talk of cannibalism, not out of desperation, but out of ignorance or deliberate deviation. A kindred cut off from Petch, lacking a shaper, or simply too ambitious, might turn inward, consuming their own dead to preserve biomass. But Kroot flesh, laced with already unstable DNA from previous meals, is like drinking from a cup that's already been poisoned a dozen times over. It compounds the corruption. Layer after layer of genetic confusion until the result is something barely recognizable. There are some fan theories that say these acts have given rise to entirely new offshoots of the Kroot, feral, monstrous, and no longer in control of their evolution. Beasts, not people. That's where the Shapers come back into the picture, and why their role is so much more than ceremonial. They are the keepers of genetic integrity. Every decision they make, every enemy they allow their kindred to consume, every forbidden corpse they steer their people away from, is about maintaining a stable identity. You could even say, Shapers are the immune system of Kroot society. Without them, kindreds drift. They forget who they are. Their evolution unravels into chaos. It's no wonder that Kroot without a Shaper are considered lost. Not in a symbolic way, literally lost in body and in soul. And this leads to some really interesting discussions in fan circles. Like, are there Kroot worlds or kindreds out there that have already passed the point of no return? Whole populations that evolved themselves into extinction or into some hideous divergent form that's too dangerous or alien to reintegrate? Some believe that in the deepest parts of the galaxy, there are feral Kroot empires, savage, tribal, mutated, who no longer recognize their origins. They don't serve the Tau. They don't even remember Petch. They just continue consuming, driven by a corrupted version of their ancestral instincts. It's like a warning. This is what happens when evolution runs wild without guidance. It's not just a biological concern either. It's cultural. Because when a Kroot mutates too far, they don't just lose control of their body, they lose the stories, the rituals, the words that anchored them to the kindred. Language begins to break down. Traditions fade. What remains is raw instinct and hunger. You can see echoes of this in the Kroot hounds, who may very well be Kroot offshoots that lost the ability to speak but retained enough loyalty to be useful. Or in the Kroot hawks, massive and bestial, used as living tanks. These aren't just subspecies, they might be the fossil record of past mistakes. And it's not like there's a reset button. Once a kindred goes too far, the damage is done. Their offspring carry the corrupted code. And even if they try to cleanse themselves with more stable DNA, there's no guarantee the fix will work. Genetic chaos doesn't erase cleanly. It lingers. It tangles up every generation after with instability and mutation. That's why discipline in what the kindred eats is taken so seriously. One feast can doom you. There's a grim beauty in how tightly the Kroot walk this evolutionary edge. They have so much potential, so many directions they could go, but they've had to chain that power to caution. They know firsthand what happens when you evolve recklessly. Their biology is a gift that comes with a curse, and their survival depends entirely on remembering that. So yeah, Kroot evolution is powerful, but it's dangerous, it's seductive. The more you push it, the more you risk unraveling everything. And for a people who define themselves through flesh, through memory, through the path their ancestors carved with tooth and claw, that risk is more than biological, it's existential. There's something hauntingly poetic about the Kroot standing at the edge of their own evolutionary potential. They're not like the other races of the galaxy, locked into static genetics and slow generational adaptation. The Kroot have a gift, one so powerful it borders on terrifying. They don't need science to shape themselves. They don't need technology or surgery. They just need a knife, a campfire, and the right body to consume. Through this primal but effective method, they could become anything, and that raises the question, why haven't they? The idea that the Kroot could evolve deliberately, not just reactively, has fascinated fans for years. Think about it. If a kindred planned every meal over generations, guided not just by shaper intuition but by long-term strategic thinking, they could design themselves stronger, faster, smarter, stealthier, psychically resistant, adapted to zero gravity or deep-sea warfare. The possibilities are staggering. Evolution as a conscious act. Controlled transformation. Not just survival, but ascension. You can already see hints of this in how some kindreds specialize. The existence of units like Kroot hounds, Krootoks, and the legendary Kroot carnivores implies that this kind of differentiation is possible. Some believe that these aren't naturally occurring offshoots, but intentional results of directed consumption. Shapers could be running miniature breeding programs, not through genetic manipulation in a lab, but through generations of careful feeding and pairings. It's not entirely confirmed in lore, but the pieces are there, and the theory feels grounded. The Kroot may already be shaping themselves, just not at the galactic scale, yet. So then the next step becomes, could we see the rise of higher Kroot? Beings who are not just better adapted physically, but cognitively. Philosophers, strategists, diplomats even. Something beyond what we've seen so far. It wouldn't take much to imagine a kindred choosing to consume particularly gifted or intelligent prey species to strengthen their mental acuity, or even targeting psykers in an attempt to breed Kroot with rudimentary warp sensitivity. It's risky, sure, but the payoff could be incredible. A Kroot navigator? A Kroot librarian-class being? If they ever pulled it off, it would change their role in the galaxy forever. That's where a lot of fan theories come in. Some people speculate that secretive kindreds on the fringes of known space have already begun this process. There's talk of Kroot societies with caste systems where each caste is created through specialized consumption and serves a function, like miniature wags but with genetic intent instead of psychic chaos. Imagine a kindred with a hunter caste, a protector caste, a medic caste, all evolved through generations of dietary planning. It would be the ultimate organic machine. No need for tools. They are the tools. Their biology is their tech. But here's where things get uncomfortable. If they go too far, if the Kroot begin optimizing themselves, pushing toward perfection, do they lose what makes them Kroot? That's the core of the ethical dilemma that's often raised in these conversations. Identity in Kroot culture is already tied to change. They're born from transformation. But is there a line where transformation becomes erasure? If a kindred engineers itself so completely that it no longer speaks the old tongue, no longer lives like its ancestors, no longer remembers Peksh, are they still Kroot? Or something else entirely? The Shapers, for all their mysticism and control, might already be struggling with this. On one hand, they are the guardians of evolution. On the other, they are its gatekeepers. They allow it, they direct it, but they also fear its consequences. You can feel that tension in the way they treat forbidden prey. There's power out there in the stars, daemons, psykers, mutants, but the price of consuming that kind of flesh might be the soul of the kindred itself. It's the old question. Just because you can, should you? And yet, the galaxy is changing. The Tau Empire, which the Kroot have long allied with, is expanding rapidly. The threats are escalating. If the Kroot don't evolve intentionally, they might be left behind, or worse, used up. It's not hard to imagine a future where Kroot leaders begin pushing harder, not just surviving, but designing a race that can finally claim its own power and position. No longer mercenaries, no longer just allies, but something self-determined, something formidable. So yes, the Kroot could control their evolution. They could choose the shape of their future. The real question is, will they? And if they do, how far will they go before there's nothing left of the forest-dwelling hunters they once were? Maybe the path forward means letting go of who they've been. Or maybe the only way to preserve themselves is to evolve with even greater care, never forgetting that each meal is more than sustenance. It's a step into the next version of who they are, or who they might become. There's something quietly sacred about the idea of Pekshan Kroot lore. It's not just a homeworld, it's an anchor, a biological memory, a spiritual reset point. Whenever you hear veterans of the Kroot kindred speak of Pek, there's this weight in their words, a kind of reverence that feels deeper than nationalism or planetary pride. It's like Pek isn't just where they come from, it's what holds them together. And for a species whose identity is so fluid, so dependent on what they consume and how they evolve, that connection might be the only thing stopping them from unraveling entirely. You start to understand the significance of Pech when you consider how unstable Kroot biology really is. We've talked about how their genetics shift with every meal, how shapers have to constantly manage the risks of mutation and corruption. But then you realize there has to be a baseline, a point of origin, something to compare yourself to and pull back toward when you've gone too far. That's where Pech comes in. The planet itself, with its dense forests, its unique biosphere, its unspoken rhythms, it's more than terrain, it's homeostasis. It's the original Kroot blueprint, alive in the very air and soil. There are theories that say returning to Pech can actually help stabilize a kindred that's starting to drift too far genetically, like a biological reset button. By living off the native flora and fauna for a few generations, some believe the Kroot can flush out unstable traits and re-anchor their DNA in something purer. Maybe it's not a perfect fix, mutations don't just vanish, but it might help push things back toward the center. It's not like there's a scientific explanation behind it in the lore, but the idea has legs. There's a kind of poetic logic to it. When you've changed too much, go home. Let the land remind your body what it was supposed to be. It's also worth thinking about how the environment of Pech itself might influence Kroot biology. This is a species that changes based on input, and ecosystems are just massive inputs. The predators, the prey, the microbial life, all of it could be subtly shaping Kroot physiology in ways we don't even see. Maybe there are microbes in Pech's soil that help regulate genetic activity. Maybe the plants contain compounds that suppress instability. Or maybe it's psychological. The feeling of being surrounded by ancient trees, walking trails your ancestors walked, breathing the same atmosphere they breathed, it could trigger something ancestral, some kind of built-in epigenetic switch that tells the Kroot genome. This is the origin. This is where you're meant to be. And this leads us to the idea of genetic memory. We usually think of memory as something tied to the brain, to experience. But with the Kroot, who evolve with every generation based on environmental and dietary input, could there be memory stored in the genes themselves? A kind of inherited instinct, not just for behavior, but for identity? Fans have speculated that the Kroot might carry imprints of Pech in their very code, a gravitational pull toward their roots. It's not clear if that's mystical or biological, but honestly, with a species like the Kroot, the two aren't always separate. I've always loved the idea that the forests of Pech aren't just beautiful or deadly, they're sacred. Not in a religious sense necessarily, but in a cultural one. Those trees aren't just trees, they're witnesses, silent observers of a million generations of Kroot passing through, evolving, changing, coming home. To raise a child in those woods isn't just practical, it's meaningful. You're giving them more than food and shelter. You're giving them context, a sense of continuity in a world where identity is fluid and biology is constantly shifting. Some stories suggest that kindreds who stray too far from Pech eventually lose something intangible, like a piece of themselves begins to drift. Their speech changes, their rituals fade, even their bodies start to look off. It's subtle at first, a slight warping of the limbs, an unusual coloration, a change in posture. But over time, the connection breaks. And when that happens, some say it doesn't matter what you eat or how many battles you win, you're not Kroot anymore. Not really. So Pech matters. It matters in ways that are difficult to measure, even harder to define. It's the quiet force that holds the Kroot together, genetically and spiritually. It's the birthplace of their shapers, their traditions, their instincts. When kindreds return to it, they're not just going back, they're reconnecting with something essential. Something that no mutation, no war, no alliance can replace. For a species made of everything they've ever consumed, Pech is the one thing that still belongs only to them. The alliance between the Kroot and the Tau is one of the most curious and honestly uneasy partnerships in the entire galaxy. On the surface, it looks mutually beneficial. Kroot get access to advanced tech, protection, and a constant stream of employment as mercenaries. The Tau get a highly adaptable, disposable auxiliary force that excels at close-quarters combat. But when you dig deeper, especially when you start asking questions about reproduction, lineage, and evolution, things get a lot murkier. Because the Tau might not be forcing anything outright, but you can feel it. There's a quiet, creeping influence. and it's starting to shape the Kroot from the inside. Let's start with the obvious. The Tau don't eat their enemies. Their whole culture is rooted in structure, harmony, and centralized control. The Kroot, by contrast, are chaotic in a biological sense, constantly shifting, reshaping themselves based on what they consume. That contrast alone creates tension. While the Tau likely understand the tactical usefulness of Kroot evolution, they probably see it as unpredictable and dangerous. And in a society like the Tau Empire, unpredictability tends to get managed. So what do the Tau do? They don't forbid the Kroot from consuming certain species outright. That would violate the pretense of respect and autonomy. But there are strong indications that they recommend against certain forms of consumption. Maybe not in the form of direct orders, but through policy, military provisioning, and contracts. For example, a kindred deployed with a Tau force might only have access to rations provided by the Tau. Battlefield dead could be off limits. Sanitary protocols, respect for the fallen. The polite ways bureaucracies assert control. Over time, these restrictions start to limit what kindreds can safely consume. And when you restrict their diet, you start to shape their evolution. That leads into the really big fan theory, that some Kroot lineages are now being cultivated to serve specific functions within the Tau military structure. Not through cloning or lab-grown manipulation, but through careful, multi-generational influence. The Tau identify kindreds with traits they like: loyalty, predictability, physical consistency, and funnel them into stable, clean, repeatable environments. Over time, those lineages become less wild, less experimental. They don't mutate unpredictably. They don't eat anything problematic. They become exactly what the Tau want: reliable tools. Still Kroot, technically, but with the edge worn down. This doesn't have to be malicious. From the Tau perspective, it might even be seen as benevolent. They're protecting the Kroot from genetic instability. They're offering order, resources, structure. But from a cultural standpoint, it starts to look like something else: domestication. The wild, feral, dangerously creative potential of the Kroot being tamed, softened, made safe for empire building. And for a species whose entire identity is built around change, adaptation, and freedom, that's a massive shift. There are whispers among fans that some shapers are beginning to push back against this quiet erosion, that they've noticed certain kindreds losing their diversity, forgetting the old ways, becoming too dependent on Tau provisioning and too distant from Peksh. These shapers might still serve the Tau. After all, that alliance brings survival, but they're also working behind the scenes to keep the genetic fire alive. Choosing battlefields carefully, seeking out specific enemies to consume, even when the Tau advise against it. There's a subtle resistance in that, a way to say, we are still Kroot, even if we wear your colors. But the tension is only going to grow. As the Tau Empire expands, and as their centralized systems stretch further and become more sophisticated, the room for Kroot autonomy will shrink. Even now, some fans speculate about Tau-approved breeding programs, kindreds that breed true, generation after generation, because they've been so tightly curated. It sounds far-fetched, but in a setting like 40K, where control is always creeping in from the edges, it's not impossible. The Tau don't need to enslave the Kroot. They just need to manage them, gently, patiently, systematically, until they're only evolving in directions that fit the greater good. And that's the real danger here. Not war, not conquest, not outright genocide, but cultural drift. A slow fading of difference, washed away by shared logistics, restricted diets, and inherited loyalty. You can see the beginnings of it in how some Kroot now speak Tau first, not their own tongue. In how fewer and fewer kindreds make pilgrimages back to Pek. In how certain shapers now wear Tau-inspired armor. It's subtle, but it's there. The Kroot are still wild, but only where the Tau allow them to be. So the alliance, while valuable, is also corrosive. It's not destroying the Kroot, it's rewriting them. And as that process continues, the question becomes whether any of them will have the strength or the will to remember what they were before. Whether any kindreds will step away from the polished battlefields and back into the forests, hungry not just for flesh, but for identity. Because in the end, evolution without freedom isn't evolution at all. It's programming. And if the Kroot lose that last spark of wild choice, they might not even notice when they've stopped being Kroot entirely. Every time I see a Kroot hound loping beside its kindred or a lumbering Krootox smashing through enemy lines, I can't help but wonder, what are they really? Are they just beasts, pets, biological tools of war? Or are they something far stranger, something far more tragic? Because there's this underlying theory that haunts fan discussions, that Kroot hounds and Krootox weren't always like this. That they used to be just like every other Kroot, thinking, speaking, choosing, and that somewhere along the evolutionary path, they slipped too far, evolved into roles that cost them their minds. And if that's true, then maybe what we're seeing isn't just adaptation, it's devolution. Let's break this down. The Kroot, as we know, adapt based on what they eat. Their biology takes in foreign DNA and shifts over generations. So what happens when a kindred overindulges in particularly aggressive or physically dominant prey? Creatures that don't prioritize higher thought, but raw instinct? Over time, the Kroot that descend from those bloodlines could begin to emphasize traits like strength, speed, heightened senses, and lose traits like speech, critical thinking, or even culture. That's one of the prevailing fan theories about Kroot hounds, that they were once regular Kroot who specialized too hard, who became hyper-adapted hunters until there was nothing left but tooth and reflex. The same idea gets tossed around with Krootox. Their massive bulk, their beast of burden behavior, it doesn't exactly scream sapient being. But look closer. They still have that familiar cranial shape. They still move in formation, obeying shaper commands. There's just enough familiarity there to suggest they didn't start as separate creatures. They might have been pushed, slowly, generation by generation, into becoming living siege weapons. Not because they wanted to, but because someone needed them to be. And that brings us to one of the heavier ideas. Do the Kroot choose to create hounds and oxen? Or are these forms accidental casualties of an aggressive evolutionary system? Some fans believe the Shapers intentionally breed these roles into existence, guiding the diet of select lineages, knowing full well the result will be a Kroot that is no longer truly Kroot. A beast, a tool, a weapon, but a necessary one. And that's where it starts to feel almost cruel. Because if that's the case, what does it say about how the Kroot view their own? There are accounts, very subtle hints in background material, that suggest Kroot hounds are still treated with a degree of familiarity and even affection. They aren't caged or leashed like pets. They're part of the hunt, trusted companions. And yet they don't speak. They don't take part in kindred decisions. They're led, not consulted. The same is true for Krootox. They carry the weapons, bear the burdens, throw themselves into the line of fire. But no one hands them a rifle. No one trains them to lead. They serve, faithfully, wordlessly. Some see this as evidence that these creatures have truly diverged, that they're no longer sentient, no longer aware. But others, more grimly, believe there's still something there. A flicker of self, muted, buried deep, unreachable through instinct and mutation. It's not a dominant theory, but it's a disturbing one. That behind those predatory eyes or beneath that massive skull, there might still be a being who remembers language, who dreams in flashes of what it used to be. And if that's true, then Kroot hounds and Krootox aren't just evolutionary offshoots, they're the forgotten. This opens up the next big question. Could they ever be restored? Could a Shaper, through controlled diet and selective breeding, bring a Krootox back into a more upright thinking form? Could a Kroot hound regain language, culture, identity? It's speculative. But biologically, the Kroot genome is so malleable that the answer might actually be yes. But would anyone want to? These creatures serve vital roles in Kroot warfare. They're effective, efficient. Would the kindred risk losing that to satisfy philosophical curiosity or sentimentality? And more importantly, would the hounds or oxen themselves even want to come back, if they could understand what they've lost? It's a heavy thought, because it reframes the way we look at evolution within Kroot culture. If every genetic path is a fork in the road, then becoming a hound or an ox might not be advancement. It might be finality, a point of no return. And that puts a terrible weight on the shoulders of Shapers, who must decide which lines are preserved and which are guided toward utility at the cost of identity. There's a quiet tragedy in that. A kind of self-sacrifice baked into the very biology of the species. Not every Kroot will become a hunter, a warrior, or a leader. Some will become claws, some will become backs that carry. and some will lose their names, their speech, their history, just to give the kindred one more tool for survival. So when you see a Kroot hound sprinting into battle or a Kroot ox bracing under the weight of a heavy gun, don't just see a beast, see a possibility, a path taken too far, a branch of the tree that grew into shadow instead of light. And remember, this isn't just evolution, it's cost. If you've spent any time studying the Kroot, or even just reading between the lines of their lore, you start to realize that their concept of reproduction is far more than just biology. For them, the act of creating life isn't just a means to ensure survival. It's philosophical, it's spiritual. There's a whole worldview behind it, one built on the idea that flesh carries memory, and that to shape a new Kroot is to carry forward not just genes, but stories, identity, purpose. Kroot don't build statues, they don't keep written records, they don't seem to value permanence in the way other species do. But what they do preserve, meticulously and with sacred precision, is the body. Or more specifically, what the body can become. Every new life in a kindred is not seen as a blank slate, but as a continuation. A vessel already etched with the echoes of ancestors, of consumed prey, of victories and defeats absorbed through generations of careful, deliberate eating. That's where the soul of Kroot culture lives. Not in ink, not in stone, but in flesh. There are theories among fans that some Kroot kindreds view reproduction as a deeply sacred act, not in the romantic or familial sense, but in a communal and metaphysical one. That to reproduce is to accept the weight of continuity. That every child is a living archive, made of ancestral flesh, shaped by deliberate consumption and filled with potential that ties back to the very origin of their kindred. It's not about creating a new person, it's about carrying forward a legacy. And that legacy is intimately tied to the idea of memory through body. It's often speculated that Kroot believe memory, even consciousness, can be passed not just through DNA, but through eating. Not literally, of course. Not a clean download of thoughts or feelings, but echoes, impressions, subtle inclinations that influence the personality and skills of the offspring. If a kindred consumes a great warrior, perhaps their descendants will inherit that warrior's aggression or tactical mind. If they consume a wise alien scholar, maybe the next generation speaks with strange insight. It's not perfect, it's not consistent. But for the Kroot, it's real. And that opens the door to something even more esoteric: reincarnation through consumption. There's a persistent fan theory that some Kroot believe consuming the flesh of a fallen elder, particularly a shaper, allows their essence to live on within the kindred. That the act is not cannibalism but communion. That by eating the wise and the strong of their own people, they preserve them, not as ghosts or spirits, but as influence embedded in the very flesh of the young. It's an eerie, visceral belief, but one that fits perfectly with how the Kroot see the body as sacred and malleable. This theory finds further weight in some of the rituals that have been hinted at in various sources. Shapers are known to guide the consumption of the kindred, not just for survival, but for meaning. The prey chosen, the parts eaten, even the manner of preparation, these can be symbolic. Consuming the heart might be a sign of taking in courage, the brain, wisdom, the hands, skill. It's not superstition either, it's philosophy through digestion. It blurs the lines between nourishment, knowledge, and reverence. When a child is born, it's likely that rituals mark the event, not with celebration as much as with solemnity. Some fans imagine that newborns are introduced to the kindred, not with names, but with intentions, that a shaper might look at the child and speak of the flesh that built it. This one is of the blade, of the fast ones, of the forest dwellers. It's less about destiny and more about acknowledgement, a way of saying, this is what we've made, now we will guide it. There may even be ceremonies where elders present specific prey for the parents to consume before reproduction, symbolically choosing the traits they hope to pass on. All of this underscores one core idea. For the Kroot, reproduction is not random or even entirely natural. It is a crafted act, a ritual of continuity. Each child is a future bearer of the kindred's strength, but also its burdens. The decision to bring new life into the world isn't about love or expansion. It's about preservation, about ensuring that the knowledge, the flesh, the soul of the past doesn't vanish into the void. But it's also a question of control. Because the more intentional reproduction becomes, the more pressure falls on the shapers to maintain balance, not just biologically, but philosophically. If they choose the wrong path, eat the wrong prey, birth the wrong child, it could shift the entire kindred. That's why reproduction, in many ways, is their most dangerous responsibility. It's not just about making more Kroot, it's about deciding what kind of Kroot the kindred will become. So when you think about Kroot reproduction, try to leave behind the usual sci-fi tropes of egg-laying or mammalian birth cycles. Think instead of a forest clearing at night, a shaper surrounded by their kindred, a fire burning, prey laid out not just for eating, but for meaning. A child born not as an accident, but as a vessel, a body built from flesh, memory, and choice. That's how the Kroot reproduce, not through passion, not through instinct, through philosophy, through flesh. There's something about the Jokaero that just messes with your brain the longer you think about them. On the surface, they look ridiculous. Bright-eyed, orange-furred, waddling around like space orangutans with toolkits strapped to their backs. And yet, these silent, simian beings are capable of casually crafting gravitic warp drives, pocket-sized force fields, and weapons that put the Adeptus Mechanicus to shame. They don't talk, don't explain, don't negotiate, they just build. And somehow, in that contradiction between their primitive appearance and godlike technical ability, lies one of the strangest mysteries in the galaxy. What are they, biologically? At first glance, they're clearly modeled on something simian. That's been the joke for years. Space monkeys that outsmart tech priests. But it's more than just a gag. Their body structure resembles that of Terran great apes, specifically orangutans, almost eerily so. Long arms, short legs, expressive faces. But then they do something like calibrate a multispectral energy lattice with their bare hands, and you start to realize this isn't some coincidence. It feels designed. And that's where the real question kicks in. Did they evolve this way naturally, or were they engineered to be like this? The lack of spoken language only deepens the mystery. They don't communicate in any human sense. No words, no psychic signals, no technolingua. Just grunts, gestures, and yet somehow, they work together perfectly. They understand each other instinctively. No one teaches them how to build, and yet they all build. No manuals, no research, just immediate, hyper-precise construction. It's like they share a kind of built-in technical intuition. That raises a ton of questions. Is their intelligence genetic? Is it a kind of inherited memory? Are they born knowing how to construct complex technologies? And if so, who put that knowledge there? A popular fan theory, and honestly, one that makes a disturbing amount of sense, is that the Jokaero are the result of some ancient techno-experiment. Maybe by the old ones. Maybe by some pre-imperial human civilization. Maybe even by the Men of Iron or something older. The theory goes that the Jokaero were created as a servitor species, designed not for manual labor, but for advanced tech repair and development. Their simian form was selected not by chance, but because of the dexterity and problem-solving capacity inherent in ape-like creatures. In other words, they're not apes that became intelligent, they're intelligence given ape form. That theory would also explain why there's seemingly no Jokaero culture, no homeworld we know of, no art, no literature, no architecture, just wandering individuals or small groups, always fixing, tinkering, improving. It's like their whole species is in a kind of eternal fugue state, just doing, without context, without history. They don't speak of where they come from because maybe they don't know, or maybe they can't. If they were engineered to function without a self-concept, without individuality, it would explain a lot. And that brings us to one of the weirdest details that fans have noticed. Jokaero all seem the same, not in personality but physically. There's no documented case of obvious sexual dimorphism, no mention of age ranges, no visible variation in height, size, or even behavior. If you lined up 10 Jokaero side by side, you'd probably assume they were clones, which leads to a chilling possibility. Maybe they are. What if the Jokaero don't reproduce biologically in the traditional sense? What if every single one we've ever seen is a product of replication, organic printing, cloning, or some other forgotten process tied to ancient tech? That would explain the uniformity. It would also explain why they don't seem to build societies. If they don't need to pass on knowledge, if they're just made with everything pre-installed, then culture becomes irrelevant. Family becomes irrelevant. Even time becomes irrelevant. They just exist as long as they're needed. Some even speculate that the Jokaero have a kind of fail-safe mechanism, an embedded program that triggers replication only under specific conditions. Maybe certain frequencies, signals, or environmental factors activate the creation of a new Jokaero. Or maybe they're grown in hidden caches across the galaxy, and the ones we see are just the result of those systems kicking back on after millennia of dormancy. It's a wild thought, but in 40K, wild usually means not nearly insane enough. And yet, for all these theories, we still don't know. We've never seen a Jokaero die of old age, never seen one grow up from infancy, never seen one act emotionally or express individuality beyond their moment-to-moment tinkering. It's like they exist outside the flow of normal biological life. And if that's true, then asking what they are biologically might be the wrong question entirely. Maybe they're not a species. Maybe they're a mechanism, a process disguised in flesh. So next time you see a Jokaero soldering a fusion array with a spoon and a piece of string, don't laugh. Don't dismiss it as comic relief. Look closer. Wonder what ancient mind built a species like this. And ask yourself the question the Imperium is too afraid to answer. Are the Jokaero alive, or are they just the universe remembering how to build? There's something quietly eerie about how little we know, or even can know, about how the Jokaero reproduce. In a galaxy obsessed with bloodlines, purity, genetic stability, and breeding programs, the Jokaero are just there. They exist. They show up in ones and twos, fix impossible tech, build miracle devices, and then vanish again. There are no reports of Jokaero infants, no family groups, no pairings, no visible sexual dimorphism, no graves, no birthplaces, nothing. It's like they arrive from nowhere, fully formed, tools in hand, ready to build. And that total void of information? It's more than just mysterious, it's unnatural. One of the most popular theories among fans, and it's honestly the one that haunts me the most, is that the Jokaero are asexual in the truest, most alien sense of the word. That they don't mate, don't combine genetic material, don't even care about reproduction the way other species do. Instead, they replicate through something more direct. Budding maybe, spontaneous cell division, some kind of biological fission. Imagine one Jokaero just wandering off into a cave, sitting still for a few days, and then two coming back out. No ritual, no emotion, just division. A mechanical biological process embedded so deeply into their being that it's as mundane as eating. But even that feels too organic, because the more you look at their behavior, the more they resemble not a species, but a system. A set of functions carried out by flesh. And that's where the even stranger theories come in. What if Jokaero don't reproduce biologically at all? What if they're made? Some fans believe Jokaero are the products of a lost manufacturing process, grown or printed in facilities left behind by a long-dead civilization. It wouldn't be cloning in the traditional sense. It would be constructive emergence. Nano-assemblies piecing together biological forms based on templates stored in ancient machines. The Jokaero would just appear, like servitors grown from vats, but with autonomy. Genius. Purpose. Maybe there are still automated systems out there producing them in secret. A derelict moonbase, a hidden Dyson fragment, or something even stranger, like a ship that drifts silently through the void, seeding galaxies with orangutan-shaped builders. I've seen some lore heads push the idea further, speculating that Jokaero are actually a form of smart technology that mimics life. They don't just build tech, they are tech. Their biology is just a disguise, a housing, a wrapper for something far more advanced, something designed to pass as organic so that it can interface with other life forms without triggering hostility. In this reading, a Jokaero doesn't reproduce, it deploys. It doesn't mate, it updates. Maybe when one vanishes, it's not dying, it's uploading, backing itself up, preparing for reassembly elsewhere. Some even suggest that each Jokaero is part of a broader intelligence, a distributed mind spread across the galaxy. They appear disconnected, but they all follow the same instinctive logic, build using the same incomprehensible principles, and never contradict one another. If that's true, then reproduction is just a question of logistics. The system determines it needs another node and a new Jokaero is created, built, grown, or folded out of space-time, who even knows? But it's not biological, it's procedural. Still, I can't help but wonder, If Jokaero do reproduce in some way, is there any awareness of it among them? Do they know where they come from? Do they recognize others as kin? There's no indication of hierarchy, no deference, no parental behavior. Every Jokaero we've seen acts as if it's completely self-contained, entirely autonomous. It's like every one of them is an isolated genius, operating on instinct and insight with zero need for emotional or social reinforcement. It's kind of beautiful and kind of terrifying. Of course, the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Maybe they do have families, hidden somewhere far from prying eyes. Maybe their reproduction happens in total secrecy, deep within structures no outsider has ever witnessed. But that in itself raises another question. If they have nothing to hide, why hide it? Why is their reproductive behavior so completely invisible in a galaxy that tracks these things obsessively? There are entire tomes written about orc spore cycles. We've got field reports on Tyranid gestation chambers. But the Jokaero? Not a single confirmed observation, not even a rumor that sticks. So maybe that's the point. Maybe they don't reproduce because they don't need to. Or maybe they do, but on a scale of time or dimension that we simply can't perceive. What looks like stasis to us might be an ecosystem functioning on a plane we're not evolved to comprehend. And that's the genius of the Jokaero. They're not just a mystery because we lack data. They're a mystery because they defy our categories. Life or machine, beast or mind, reproduction or recursion. We don't know. We can't know. Because the Jokaero might be the living embodiment of a deeper truth in the 40K universe, that not everything that lives was meant to breed. Some things were just meant to be. The more you think about the Jokaero, the harder it becomes to even call them a species in the traditional sense. I mean, sure, we slap the Xenos label on them because they're organic, mobile, and definitely not human. But past that, they don't behave like a biological population. They don't change. They don't age. They don't vary. Every single one appears to be exactly the same. Same size, same fur pattern, same capacity for impossible invention. If it weren't for contact clues and scattered imperial records, you'd think it was just the same individual showing up again and again across the stars. That eerie sameness is what really gets under the skin of a lot of fans. In a universe where evolution is often brutal and constant, where species like the Tyranids mutate on the fly and even orcs adapt based on local conditions, the Jokaero are frozen, static, eternal. And that opens up a whole barrel of weird questions. If they don't evolve, how do they adapt? And more fundamentally, how do they persist? Evolution is usually driven by selective pressure. Environmental challenges, competition, reproduction, mutation, all the messy processes that push a species to diversify and refine its traits over time. But with the Jokaero, there's no evidence of any of that. No juvenile stages, no visible elders, no cultural change. Just one form, endlessly repeated, showing the same genius-level technical ability, no matter the context. It's like their design was perfected once and then locked in place forever. That's not adaptation. That's preservation. There's a school of thought among lore enthusiasts that calls this genetic stasis. The idea that Jokaero biology is either incapable of mutating or actively resists mutation. They might have hard-coded genetic self-correction routines, some kind of biological checksum that prevents change from occurring over generations. Or perhaps more disturbingly, there are no generations. Just the same being, duplicated again and again, perfect copies of a singular original. Which leads us straight to the core of one of the creepiest theories out there. What if there aren't multiple Jokaero at all? Some fans speculate that what we're seeing across the Imperium isn't a population. It's instances, replicas of a single entity. Not clones exactly, but a central being fragmented into countless autonomous units, each one carrying the same genetic payload, the same purpose, the same memory-deep instinct to create, repair, improve. It would explain a lot. The uniform behavior, the complete lack of social interaction, the ability to understand and interface with alien technology with zero training. If they are just iterations of a single source, then evolution doesn't apply. You don't evolve a screwdriver, you just build more when you need them. And yet, somehow, they do survive. They manage to function in hostile environments, avoid extermination by the Imperium, and even thrive in isolated pockets without support or reinforcement. They don't need armies or infrastructure. A single Jokaero can vanish into the stars and turn up a century later surrounded by impossibly advanced devices. It's like each of them carries the entire instruction manual for survival inside their DNA. No need for learning, no need for society, just execution. Which brings us to the most frustrating and fascinating question of all. Are the Jokaero really a race, or are they something else entirely? A lot of fans are now leaning toward the latter. If there's no reproduction, no genetic variants, and no change across time, then calling them a species starts to feel inaccurate. They're not evolving, they're persisting. They're not multiplying, they're resurfacing. Maybe the Jokaero aren't an evolving life form at all. Maybe they're a biological artifact, a living tool created in some ancient age and left to run autonomously long after its creators were dust. It's weirdly fitting considering how obsessed they are with technology. We always assume they're creating machines for us or for themselves, but maybe every device they build is just part of their function. A way of maintaining whatever unknown system they were designed to uphold. Some lost galactic infrastructure, some machine god's invisible will. They might not even know why they do what they do. Instinct might be all that's left. And here's where it gets even wilder. If they truly don't change, if every Jokaero is a biological constant in a galaxy of chaos, then maybe that is their evolutionary advantage. They don't adapt because they don't need to. They've already achieved the optimal design. They don't improve because improvement implies deficiency. Maybe they were built to outlast everything else. Not to conquer, not to learn, just to endure. And in the grim darkness of the far future where everything else is either mutating, dying, or tearing itself apart, maybe that's enough. So no, the Jokaero probably don't evolve. But they persist, like a tool forgotten in a ruin, still sharp, still functional, still waiting to be used. And maybe, just maybe, that's more terrifying than any mutation. Because it means they've already won the evolutionary race by refusing to run it at all. When it comes to the Jokaero, maybe we've been asking the wrong question all along. We've spent so much time wondering how they reproduce, looking for signs of mating behavior, offspring, even some hint of genetic variation, that we've missed the more unsettling possibility. Maybe they don't need to. Maybe for the Jokaero, reproduction isn't about cells or DNA. Maybe it's about invention. That might sound bizarre, but think about it. Every time a Jokaero appears, they're not building shelters or raising young. They're building tools, devices, weapons. They tinker, improvise, and create in ways that no human, or any known species, can replicate. Not just functional machines, but elegant ones. Efficient, unfathomable. The kind of tech that seems to rewrite the laws of physics just by existing, and they do this effortlessly, as if it's the most natural expression of who they are. So what if that is who they are? What if these machines are their children? There's a growing theory among fans that Jokaero don't pass on their legacy through bloodlines, but through blueprints. Every device they create is a piece of themselves, encoded not in chromosomes, but in circuits. They don't build families, they build functions. And when they vanish, what remains isn't a corpse or a name. It's a gravity manipulator that still works after 10,000 years. A Lascanon that rewrites its own firing protocols on the fly. That's their version of reproduction. That's how they outlive themselves. This shifts the entire way we think about the species. We often define life by its biological imperatives: eat, survive, reproduce. But Jokaero behavior doesn't fit that loop. They don't hunt for food. They don't gather in herds. They don't mate. But they do create, relentlessly. As if that act itself is essential, not just to the individual, but to whatever purpose they serve as a species. It's almost spiritual, like a calling embedded in their bones. Not to expand their numbers, but to leave behind something that matters. Some fans believe this is because the Jokaero aren't truly autonomous beings at all, but rather a kind of interface, an extension of something larger. A vast intelligence spread thin across the galaxy. Each Jokaero is just one node of a cosmic processor, a biological tool designed to interpret reality, improve it, and then vanish. The inventions they leave behind aren't random. They're instructions, solutions, upgrades. Maybe not for humanity, maybe not for any known race, but for something else. Some distant future where the pieces all come together and the meaning becomes clear. There's even a more metaphysical angle that gets tossed around in fan circles, that Jokaero are the embodiment of memory itself. That instead of passing down experiences through stories or genetics, they externalize their memory through invention. That every device, every machine they leave behind remembers them, like a gravestone that still functions. A eulogy that can turn invisible, fly, and hack enemy satellites. It's the most literal form of legacy imaginable. Not just a memory of who they were, but a working example of what they could do. And if that's the case, maybe reproduction, at least in the way we understand it, is irrelevant to them. Their devices endure, their tools adapt, their technology spreads. They don't need to survive individually because their creations outlive them. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the point. Not to create more Jokaero, but to leave behind better tools, better systems, better possibilities. Some fans have even speculated that the reason we don't see Jokaero societies or cities is because they don't need civilization to replicate culture. Their culture is technology. Their language is hardware. Their history is firmware. Every tool is a story. Every weapon is a thesis. You want to understand a Jokaero? Don't talk to them. Use what they left behind. And here's the wildest part. What if the Jokaero know they're fading? What if they understand that their biology won't continue? That their time is limited, but they've chosen to spend that time creating instead of reproducing? What if every Jokaero who builds something is making a conscious sacrifice? I will not make more of me, but I will make something better, something useful. That's not survival, it's purpose. It's an act of devotion. And it raises one final, chilling question. When the last Jokaero disappears, will we even notice? Or will we be too busy using the things they left behind, improving our own lives, our own machines, our own understanding of the universe, without ever realizing we're living in the echo of something greater? Because maybe, just maybe, that's what the Jokaero were always meant to be. Not a people, but a legacy. Not parents, but inventors. Not a species, but a message. And that message doesn't need a voice. It needs a circuit, a field. A device left behind in the dark, humming with knowledge no one yet understands. A kind of immortality that doesn't breathe, but builds. The Laer are one of those Xenos species that seem to slip through the cracks of the galaxy. Not because they're insignificant, but because they're too alien, too disturbing, even by grimdark standards. When people do mention them, it's usually in hushed tones, wrapped in horror stories of failed containment protocols and unspeakable corruption. And yet, for all the disgust and fear they inspire, there's something hauntingly fascinating about what they represent. The Laer aren't just strange, they're a living metaphor for the dangers of unchecked adaptation. A species that may have evolved too far, too fast, and lost itself along the way. Biologically, the Laer are unlike anything else in the Imperium's bestiaries. They resemble sinuous, serpentine creatures, slick with mucosal secretions and coated in semi-translucent skin. They glide more than crawl, their bodies fluid in movement and unnerving in their silence. Reports suggest they're hermaphroditic, possibly capable of shifting sexual characteristics at will, or perhaps they've abandoned binary sex altogether. There's no clear data on Laer reproductive anatomy, which isn't surprising given that the few who've studied them closely tend not to live very long or die wrong. There's a certain grotesque elegance in their design. Every part of them appears engineered for sensory input, sensory overload even. Their flesh is covered in fine, vibrating cilia. Their nerves are hyper-responsive. Their brains are wired less for thought and more for experience. Some scholars speculate that their evolution pushed them toward such extreme sensory receptivity that they began perceiving not just light or sound, but raw emotional and psychic stimuli. They didn't just feel the world, they merged with it. And that's where things may have gone terribly wrong. The prevailing theory among those brave or foolish enough to speculate is that the Laer's biology became too porous, too open to sensation, too adaptable. What began as evolutionary refinement tipped into biological vulnerability. As they honed themselves to absorb more from the world, they became unable to filter it. Eventually, exposure to certain psychic frequencies, warp energies, or even excessive emotional fields began to alter them. Not through mutation in the usual sense, but through a kind of psychobiological infection. It's whispered that some Laer can no longer be distinguished from the sensations they absorb. that they lose all sense of self, becoming addicts to touch, to feeling, to presence. Not in a metaphorical sense, but literally. Their cells rewrite themselves to reflect what they experience. They become their desires. Their biology, once a flexible tool, turns inward and collapses. And this is where reproduction becomes a fascinating, terrifying question. If their bodies are constantly in flux, constantly rewriting themselves to suit the moment, is stable reproduction even possible? Can you pass down genetic material if that material is never fixed? Can you create new life if the template is in a state of eternal transformation? Some believe that the Laer have reached a stage of biological exhaustion, that their reproductive systems, if they even still have them, can no longer function in a consistent way. There's speculation that they once reproduced through a form of parthenogenesis, or hermaphroditic pairing, where any two Laer could merge and split genetic data. But as their bodies became more fluid, so did their heredity. And with no stable genome, reproduction became less about continuity and more about chaos. There are darker theories still, that the Laer can reproduce, but choose not to. That the pleasure of sensation, of becoming, of being in the moment has replaced any instinct for legacy or future. In a species where the self is a temporary arrangement, what purpose does offspring even serve? If identity is fleeting, if memory can't be passed on biologically, then what is there to reproduce for? It's not extinction through warfare or plague, it's extinction by irrelevance, a slow fading away into sensation. Some fan theorists go so far as to suggest that what we see today as the Laer might not even be the original species, that they are the result of some long-forgotten experiment, perhaps self-directed, to push biology beyond structure. That there were once Laer scientists, engineers, philosophers, until they all chose the path of sensory transcendence. And now all that remains are the husks, the echoes, beings that can feel everything but remember nothing. In that sense, their reproductive decline is more than a biological malfunction. It's a philosophical endpoint. The Laer chose to chase experience instead of survival, and in doing so, they may have broken the very mechanism that allows a species to continue. They are a cautionary tale not just of adaptation, but of excess. Evolution unchained, sensation without boundaries. So when we talk about whether the Laer can still reproduce, maybe the better question is, do they want to? Or have they moved so far beyond the concept of continuity that the idea of creating a future has no meaning for them? Maybe their tragedy isn't that they're dying, but that they no longer care to live. The Nicassar are one of those species that float silently through the edges of galactic consciousness, never really drawing attention until you stop and realize how strange they truly are. These psychic, bear-like wanderers are barely visible in the lore, spoken of only in fragments and quiet footnotes. And yet, the more you think about them, the more fascinating and unsettling they become. Because what kind of species chooses to abandon planets entirely? What kind of people live exclusively in star-sailing vessels, cut off from planetary ecosystems, and still manage to persist, calm, reclusive, and gently psychic? The Nicassar are, in so many ways, a paradox, especially when it comes to the question of how they reproduce. They're powerful psychers, yes, but not in the violent or corruptive way we often see in the Imperium. Their psychic talents are softer, more passive, suggestive of telepathy, instinctive navigation, even precognition, and that sensitivity seems to extend far beyond the warp. Their entire civilization is defined by distance from others, from complexity, from noise. They drift in individual taus, small starships, more like personal shells than vessels of war. They rarely gather. They rarely intervene. Their presence within the Tau Empire is allowed only under strict isolation. But that isolation, while protective, also raises questions. If they don't form communities, don't gather in groups, and barely interact with outsiders, how do they maintain a population? There's very little official material to answer that, so naturally fans have filled in the blanks. One prominent theory is that the Nicassar employ controlled reproduction, possibly through artificial selection or even genetic engineering. Their biology appears minimalistic, round-bodied, soft-limbed, seemingly unevolved for harsh environments. This has led some to suggest that their evolutionary path has deliberately sacrificed physical robustness in exchange for psychic sensitivity. In that light, reproduction might be highly regulated, not just culturally, but genetically. Only individuals with certain psychic frequencies or mental compositions may be allowed to propagate. Others go further, theorizing that Nicassar may have abandoned sexual reproduction altogether. There's speculation about cloning, perhaps subtle, low-tech, or even entirely psychic in nature. Imagine a being so attuned to its own psychic resonance that it can impress that pattern onto a developing embryo, essentially creating a soul heir rather than a genetic child. This would allow them to maintain bloodlines without requiring traditional biology. And given their deep aversion to outside influence, it would also help preserve what some fans believe is the central tenet of Nicassar philosophy: purity of mind. Their integration with the Tau Empire adds another layer of complexity. The Tau caste system is rigid, hierarchical, and built around control. Not just military or political, but biological. While the Nicassar are technically autonomous allies, it's hard to imagine that the Tau haven't at least suggested or encouraged reproductive protocols to ensure predictability. Whether this takes the form of breeding quotas, genetic screening, or selective pairings, we don't know. But it's telling that Nicassar populations don't seem to be growing. They remain small, almost unchanged, as if someone, perhaps the Tau, perhaps the Nicassar themselves, wants it that way. This gives rise to one of the more poetic fan interpretations, that the Nicassar are a species practicing self-limitation, not in fear, but in wisdom. That they've looked at the galaxy, at the endless cycles of hunger, reproduction, war, expansion, and chosen something else, something quieter, something lighter. Maybe they believe that too much population leads to psychic noise, that expanding their numbers risks diluting their clarity, and so they choose stillness. They choose solitude, not because they can't reproduce, but because they won't, at least not in the way other species expect. There's also this idea that reproduction for the Nicassar isn't about continuity of the body, but of mind state. Some fans speculate that they pass on memories psychically, imprinting fragments of personality, experience, or instinct directly into the next generation. This wouldn't be true reincarnation, but it would create a sense of inherited wisdom without needing cultural artifacts or oral tradition. In that sense, their genetic legacy would be irrelevant. The soul, the essence, is what endures. But of course, there's a darker side to all this. What if their restraint isn't just philosophy? What if it's necessity? Some believe that the Nicassar genome is fragile, that their psychic potential is linked to deep instability, and that too much reproduction risks error, mutation, madness, warp sensitivity. By limiting their own numbers, they reduce the chances of disaster. They don't grow because growth is dangerous. Evolution might mean extinction, and so they persist, not as a rising species, but as a slow-burning ember, alive, but never flaring too brightly. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the Nicassar aren't here to build empires or spread their genes across 1,000 worlds. Maybe they're a reminder that not every species in the galaxy is obsessed with conquest or survival. Some simply drift through the stars, quietly preserving what little peace they've found, a dying ember in a galaxy of fire. And in that light, their approach to reproduction makes a kind of quiet, tragic sense. Because sometimes the greatest act of survival is knowing when not to grow. The Rak'Gol are terrifying, and not just because they look like the love child of a nightmare and a chainsaw. It's not their grotesque reptilian bodies, or the jagged cybernetic grafts protruding from every limb, or even their relentless brutality that makes them so disturbing. It's the sense that they shouldn't exist, not in the way life normally does. There's something so wrong about them, so violently purpose-built, that calling them a species feels inaccurate. The more you study them, the more you start to wonder if the Rak'Gol are even alive in the way other Xenos are. Or if they're just an endless war protocol masquerading as flesh. We know they're reptilian, or at least they started that way. Covered in scaled skin, with brutal clawed limbs and elongated skulls packed with predatory teeth, their base physiology screams natural predator. But even that description quickly falls apart when you look closer. Rak'Gol don't follow a single body plan. Some are massive, lumbering brutes. Others are smaller, sleeker, too fast for something that size. Some have multiple limbs. Some are practically walking weapons platforms. You see them in clusters, often mixed, almost like each unit was built for a specific role: scout, berserker, heavy gunner. And the cybernetics? They're not upgrades, they're core components. There's barely a Rak'Gol alive without visible augmentation. Which leads to one of the oldest questions among lore nerds: how do these things reproduce? Do they even do it biologically? We've never seen Rak'Gol families. Never seen younglings. Never even heard of a Rak'Gol showing anything resembling personal attachment. They appear in packs, murder everything in sight, and either die violently or disappear back into the void. That kind of behavior doesn't lend itself well to traditional mating structures. So the theories start rolling in. Some believe the Rak'Gol do reproduce biologically, but in a way that's entirely alien to us. Maybe they lay eggs in communal spawning pits, and those eggs are sorted, altered, or destroyed based on which caste the pack needs more of. Others think they have breeding queens like Tyranids or Vespids, and that these queens generate different forms of Rak'Gol through selective gene manipulation. But none of that's confirmed. And honestly, it feels too orderly. More compelling and more disturbing is the idea that Rak'Gol aren't born at all, that they're grown, manufactured in vats with cybernetics built into them from the moment they emerge. Their flesh is just scaffolding, their minds preloaded with instinctual code. A fan theory that's been gaining traction suggests Rak'Gol ships are actually mobile production engines, churning out new warriors based on battlefield data. You don't need natural reproduction if your ship can print war beasts in real time. And the cybernetics? They aren't upgrades, they're interface points, physical sockets for programming. That would also explain their wild genetic diversity. If each Rak'Gol is designed for a role, then they don't need hereditary consistency. They aren't trying to pass down traits, they're trying to fill a slot. Tank, scout, sniper, berserker. Traits are selected based on tactical need, not inheritance. There's no concept of lineage, no bloodlines, no ancestors, just the next unit in the production queue. And that leads to the really terrifying theory that Rak'Gol are not a species, but a program, a viral military algorithm embedded in a self-replicating biological format. The difference between them and, say, Necrons is that the Rak'Gol look like living creatures, but everything about them, everything, feels automated, purposeful, brutally efficient. Their ships aren't elegant. They're hulking, jagged murder machines. Their tactics are suicidal and overwhelming. They don't negotiate, don't speak, don't even pause. It's as if someone, somewhere, hit the go button on a war project millennia ago and then disappeared, and the code is still running. Even their mutations feel more like iterations than random variation. You'll see newer Rak'Gol types appearing in different raids, with slightly refined weapon systems or more efficient implant integration. Like the system is testing builds. Field evolving. There's no chaos to it, just constant, violent updating. And if that's true, then what we're dealing with isn't just a threat, it's a contagion. Not of disease, but of design. A process that infects the void, finds the necessary resources, and outputs killing machines until it's time to move on. No culture, no memory. No need for reproduction in the traditional sense, because the future doesn't belong to generations, it belongs to iterations. It makes you wonder, what was the original Rak'Gol like? Were they once a people, before the machines took over? Before someone, maybe even themselves, turned them into this? Was there ever a time when they raised young, sang songs, told stories? Or have they always been this way? Born in silence, lived in rage, died without meaning? We'll probably never know, because if the Rak'Gol do reproduce, it's not for family, not for legacy, it's for function, new flesh for new war. And in that context, the question of whether they're alive becomes irrelevant. They kill, they adapt, they return. That's enough. Maybe they aren't a species at all. Maybe they're a warning. The galaxy doesn't need another empire. It doesn't need another future. It needs cleansing. And the Rak'Gol are the mechanism. Not alive, not dead, just deployed. There's always been something eerie about the Vespid. Something more than just the bug eyes, the chitinous plates, or the rasping alien clicks of their language. Maybe it's the silence surrounding them. The way they march and die for the Tau Empire with unwavering loyalty, without a word of protest, without even a flicker of visible emotion. Maybe it's how perfectly obedient they are. And the more I think about that, the more I wonder if the Vespid even know who they are anymore, or if they've already lost control of their own evolution. Biologically, the Vespid are an insectoid race, winged, exoskeletal, highly mobile. We know they evolved in the harsh atmospheres of their gas giant homeworld Vespid Prime, and that they operate in swarm-like formations with a strict caste structure. There's almost no deviation in physical form within combat units, which suggests heavy biological specialization. Most fans agree they follow a hive-like reproductive model, likely centered around queens or matriarchs. If that's true, then their entire species might be governed by a centralized reproductive system, one that limits the number of new births and tightly controls genetic variability. The idea of a single or limited egg-laying queen per swarm isn't far-fetched. It mirrors countless examples in Terran insect life, and it would explain why we never hear about Vespid children or families. If all reproduction is handled by the queen caste, and all other Vespid are sterile drones or warriors, then the entire population becomes modular, replaceable, functional. The purpose of the individual becomes irrelevant. The hive is the identity. That's not just a reproductive choice, it's a cultural philosophy encoded into their DNA. But things get murkier when you add the Tau into the mix. The Vespid didn't evolve in isolation anymore. They're part of the greater good now, a species folded into an ideology not their own. And here's where it gets weird. Because the Tau didn't just ally with the Vespid, they altered them. They fitted them with communion helms, devices that allow Vespid to understand and obey Tau commands. It's more than translation, it's behavioral synchronization. Neural adaptation. That communion helm might be the single most controversial piece of tech in the entire empire. It's subtle, but deeply invasive. It doesn't just transmit language, it reshapes cognition. It aligns thoughts, priorities, emotions. What started as an alliance became something closer to biological assimilation. The Vespid now serve loyally not because they chose to, but because they think they chose to. That's a chilling concept, especially for a race that likely evolved with limited individual autonomy to begin with. Imagine being born into a hive mind, and then having that mind rewritten by an outside force. And what does that mean for their reproduction? Well, if the queens still control it, how much influence does the Tau Empire have over them? Do they monitor birthing rates, approve new swarms, alter the genetic line to better suit Tau battlefield needs? We don't know. But we do know this. We don't see rogue Vespid. No separatists, no dissidents, no evolution, just endless wings in perfect formation. It's like their future was put on hold the moment they joined the Empire. This brings us to one of the saddest, most unsettling fan theories, that the Vespid have lost the ability to steer their own biological destiny, that the communion helms, the cultural integration, the Tau protocols, they didn't just take the Vespid's freedom, they took their instinct, their evolution, their will to change. There's speculation that the queens themselves are now bound by Tau programming, subtly reconditioned over generations through selective breeding or technological imprinting. New Vespid are born not for the hive, but for the Empire. And what happens to a race when it forgets what it was? What happens when reproduction becomes reproduction for someone else? When you're not passing on your values, your instincts, your survival traits, but someone else's blueprint entirely? The Vespid may still look the same. They may still fly and fight and swarm. But are they still Vespid? Or are they just organic drones now, branded with someone else's dream? Some fans hold out hope that there are still hidden hives, isolated colonies that escape Tau influence, where queens birth new generations without external interference. Places where Vespid still sing the old songs, if they ever had them. Where their reproduction isn't a mechanism of control, but a ritual of survival. Maybe. But we haven't seen them. And every passing year under the Empire's banner makes it less likely they'll ever re-emerge. Because evolution, for all its power, is fragile. And once you hand the keys to your own future to someone else, once you let another species decide who you are and what you become, it's almost impossible to take them back. The Vespid might keep multiplying, they might keep flying, but unless something changes, they're not evolving anymore. They're just continuing. And in a galaxy this brutal, continuing without change is just another way to die slowly. In the grimdark of the 41st millennium, there is no peace, no mercy, and apparently no normal reproduction either. After diving headfirst into the mating habits, gene forging, flesh crafting, and hive seeding of every Xenos race we could find, one thing becomes overwhelmingly clear. Life in the galaxy isn't just brutal. It's bizarre. The way each race continues itself, or fails to, is a direct reflection of its culture, its trauma, and its place in this broken universe. It's not just about survival, it's about identity, control, madness, and sometimes it's about letting go entirely. The Aeldari reminded us what it means to fight for existence. With every birth a miracle, their reproductive story is one of mourning and fragile hope. A dying people walking on the edge of extinction, where parenthood is not just rare but sacred. And yet, even here, we see two mirrored paths: the noble restraint of the craft worlds, and the Drukhari's perverse, mutated parody of survival. Cloning, vat growing, and raising children not with love but with knives. They're both Aeldari, but they show us how reproduction can be twisted into preservation, corruption, or cruelty depending on who holds the scalpel. Then there are the Necrons. Creatures who gave up reproduction altogether. Once flesh beings who traded bloodlines for eternity, they now reproduce through awakening, repair, replication. In their cold logic, new life is unnecessary, persistence is enough. And yet a question lingers. Can an empire built on old ghosts and outdated code truly sustain itself forever? Or will their inability to create something new eventually turn even immortality into stagnation? Contrast that with the Orks, whose reproduction is arguably the most chaotic and effective in the galaxy. They don't breed, they happen. Sporing like fungi, seeded by death and grown by war, they're more a force of nature than a species. There is no family, no legacy, only the next fight. But even that wild cycle hides brilliance, genetic memory, caste specialization, evolution by combat. The Orks don't raise children, they raise why, and somehow it works. Then come the Tau, where reproduction is almost sterile. Engineered, calculated. Every child is born into a caste, into a purpose, into a system that watches and limits them from conception. Love, passion, instinct, these aren't welcome variables in the greater good. What matters is efficiency, loyalty, and order. It's reproduction as policy. And as they expand, we're left wondering, can a species retain its soul when even birth is an act of statecraft? The Tyranids laugh at that question. Or they would if they had mouths for anything but teeth. Their form of reproduction is consumption, pure cold absorption. Life is fuel, flesh is input. New organisms are born in birthing pools, crafted from what was devoured. There are no parents, no heritage, only purpose and design. And it works terrifyingly well. But it also begs the question, is that still life? Or is it something else? A form of evolution so efficient, so impersonal, that it erases the very idea of being alive. And then we have the Kroot, perhaps the strangest of all. They reproduce traditionally, yes, but the shaping of their children is tied directly to what they eat. Consume a warrior, birth a fighter, eat a psyker, risk a mutant. Their reproduction is half biology, half alchemy, every child a gamble. It gives them terrifying adaptability, but it also brings danger, degeneration, and loss of control. In them, we see both evolution and the cost of it. Power through hunger, identity through flesh. The Demiurg, elusive, secretive, stubborn, raise more questions than answers. Are they clones, engineers of their own children, a dying culture, or a stable machine? We don't know, but in their silence lies another truth. Sometimes the act of creation isn't biological. Sometimes it's about preserving knowledge, craft, and legacy, even if it means fewer children or none at all. The Jokaero? They break every mold. No families, no visible reproduction, no culture. Just perfect, inexplicable machines dressed in orange fur. Maybe they were engineered. Maybe they're self-replicating tools from a long-dead god. Maybe they don't need to reproduce because their creations are their legacy. Not sons or daughters, but devices, circuits, weapons. The message is clear. Not all life leaves flesh behind. And finally, the minor races, the forgotten, the fading, the fragile. The Laer, perhaps lost to their own decadence. The Nicassar, breeding slowly in drifting solitude. The Rak'Gol, who may not even reproduce, but just manifest more horror. The Vespid, enslaved by ideology, their queens possibly birthing for another's cause. Each one a footnote in imperial records, but each one a window into how strange, sad, and twisted the galaxy can be. So what does all this tell us? That reproduction in 40K isn't just a biological process. It's a mirror. Every race's way of making new life reflects their fears, their obsessions, and the horrors they've endured. Some cherish every child like a dying ember. Some forge them from flesh vats like disposable tools. Some let spores drift on war-torn winds. And some don't bother anymore, because time, war, or arrogance already stole that future from them. In a galaxy where everything is war, creation itself becomes an act of defiance. Every new life, no matter how it comes into being, is a statement. We still exist. We still have purpose. We still endure. But the real question that lingers, long after the dissecting tables and birthing pools and communion helms have faded into the background, is this. Do any of them remember why they reproduce at all? Or is survival now just a habit, echoing through flesh, code, and spore? If you've made it this far into the madness of Xenos reproduction, you're clearly one of the real lore deep divers, and I appreciate you for it. The galaxy is weird, terrifying, and endlessly fascinating. And we've only scratched the surface. So if you want to keep exploring the strange corners of Warhammer 40K with me, the forgotten races, the cursed technologies, the unsolved mysteries, don't forget to subscribe. Hit that bell so you don't miss the next deep dive into the dark. Trust me, we're just getting started.